There's a particular kind of silence that comes with old maps. Not the silence of an empty room, but the quiet of accumulated centuries pressed between pages. Imagine for a moment that you're holding an atlas from 1730. The leather binding is worn smooth at the edges, where countless hands have gripped it. When you open the cover, the paper releases a scent not unpleasant of aged wood pulp and oxidized ink, mixed with something faintly mineral, like dust from a different era. The colors have faded but not disappeared. Territorial borders are traced in pale greens and yellows, hand-drawn with the kind of precision that comes from working with a single pen nib for hours. Oceans are rendered in delicate blue washes. Mountain ranges appear as careful rows of tiny, shaded peaks. And there, sprawling across the heart of Asia, occupying more space than any European nation, is a name written in elegant calligraphy: Tartary, or sometimes Tartaria, depending on which language the cartographer was working in. You might think this is an obscure reference, something from a single eccentric mapmaker's imagination. But open another map, a Dutch atlas from 1690. The same name appears. Then try a map from 1570, crafted by Abraham Ortelius, one of the most respected cartographers of his age. There it is again, Tartaria printed in bold letters across Central Asia. These aren't forgeries or fantasy maps drawn for entertainment. They're housed in major libraries and museums. The British Library, the Library of Congress, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. They represent the serious geographical knowledge of their time, created by the same men who accurately mapped Europe, Africa, and the coastlines of newly discovered continents. On a 1690 map, you can find Tartary subdivided into distinct regions. Grand Tartary dominating the center, Tartary Chinoise to the east, Tartary Independente marked across territories that belong to no recognized power. The cartographer has drawn borders between these regions, with the same confident lines used to separate France from Spain or England from Scotland. On some maps, Tartary stretches from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, from the frozen coasts of Siberia down to the borders of China and Persia. It's vast, larger than Russia at the time, more expansive than the Ottoman Empire. A territory that, if it existed today, would dominate global geography. But today, no nation called Tartary exists. No government claims its borders. No people identify themselves as Tartarian nationals. The name itself has vanished from modern geography so completely that most people have never heard it spoken. This isn't a fringe observation. These maps were created by men like Gerardus Mercator, whose projection system we still use, Joan Bleu, whose atlases were considered the finest achievements of Dutch Golden Age cartography, Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon, Danville, whose maps of Asia were the standard reference for European scholars throughout the 18th century. When these men labelled a region Tartary, they weren't indulging in fantasy. They were documenting what they understood to be real geography, real territories, real places where real people lived. What's strange isn't that mapmakers made errors all early cartographers did, filling uncertain coastlines with speculative details or imagined islands. What's strange is the consistency. Map after map, atlas after atlas, for more than 3 centuries, Tartary appears. The name is printed with the same authority as France or China. The region is discussed in geographical texts, mentioned in travelers' accounts, referenced in diplomatic correspondence between European powers, and then it vanishes, not gradually, with borders shifting and shrinking until the name fades from use, but relatively abruptly, replaced by new terminology: Russian territories, Chinese provinces, Central Asian regions, defined by ethnic groups or Soviet republics. By the late 19th century, maps stop using the word Tartary entirely. The name doesn't evolve or transform, it simply disappears from the cartographic record. The mystery isn't whether these maps exist. You can examine them yourself in any major archive. The mystery is what they represented. What was Tartary? Was it an empire that collapsed? A geographical term for a region that was later subdivided? A European misunderstanding of complex Asian territories? And why has a name that dominated maps for 300 years been so completely forgotten that its mention today sounds like alternative history rather than documented fact? Something real is being observed here. The question is what? When you examine a 16th century map of Europe, you see precision. Cities marked by tiny illustrated buildings, rivers traced from source to sea, forests indicated by clusters of miniature trees. Political boundaries drawn with careful attention to which duke controlled which valley. These cartographers knew Europe. They'd walked its roads, sailed its coasts, interviewed its merchants and soldiers. The maps reflect intimate knowledge. Now look at how those same cartographers depicted Tartary. The contrast is immediate. Where European territories are dense with information, Tartary is sparse. Often, it's simply a vast blank space with a label. Early maps from the 1500s show Tartaria as little more than a name placed east of the Volga River, an acknowledgement that something existed out there, beyond the edge of direct European knowledge. The cartographer might sketch a few mountain ranges, draw a river or two, but the internal geography remains mysterious, undefined. By the 1600s, something shifts. European cartographers begin subdividing this enormous region into more specific territories. Grand Tartary appears across the central steppes. Chinese Tartary or Tartari Chinoise on French maps designates regions under Qing dynasty influence. Independent Tartary marks areas not clearly controlled by any recognized power. Muscovite Tartary covers lands disputed between Mongol Khanates and expanding Russia. Some maps even show Tibetan Tartary stretching across high plateaus near Tibet's borders. These subdivisions suggest increasing knowledge. The cartographers are making distinctions, drawing internal boundaries. But examine those boundaries more closely. Unlike the borders between, say, France and the Holy Roman Empire, which reflected actual treaties, fortified frontiers, and generations of warfare, the lines dividing different Tartaries are speculative, confident in their draftsmanship perhaps, but uncertain in their accuracy. What fills the spaces between these boundaries tells its own story. Some mapmakers added decorative elements, camel caravans crossing empty steppes, clusters of tents suggesting nomadic peoples, the occasional fortress or city whose exact location was anyone's guess. Others inserted Latin phrases, terra incognita, regions imperfectly known, or notes explaining that details came from travelers' accounts that might not be reliable. A few cartographers simply left vast areas blank, honest about the limits of their knowledge. The extent of Tartary itself varies wildly, depending on which map you're examining. Some cartographers restrict it to Central Asian steppes between the Caspian and Mongolia. Others extend it all the way to the Pacific coast. Some merge it with Siberia, treating them as a single, vaguely understood northern expanse. Others keep them carefully separate. The southern boundaries fluctuate dramatically based on how each mapmaker understood the relationship between Tartary and China, Persia, or the northern reaches of India. Yet certain features remain consistent. Nearly every map agrees the region is vast, that it's sparsely populated compared to Europe or China, that it's characterized by steppes and mountain ranges, that its inhabitants are peoples. Europeans know primarily through intermediaries, merchants who'd traded with them, travelers who'd passed through their territories, ambassadors who'd visited their courts, rather than through sustained direct contact. This creates a peculiar situation. The geography is real. The Asian interior genuinely exists. Mountain ranges like the Altai and Tian Shan physically rise from the earth. Rivers like the Ob and Yenisei flow north to the Arctic. Steppes stretch for thousands of miles. People live there, have lived there for millennia, built cities and empires and cultures. But European understanding of what political entities occupied those lands, what cultural or ethnic groups controlled which territories, what these peoples called themselves, that understanding was fragmentary at best. So cartographers did what mapmakers have always done when facing gaps in knowledge. They drew what they knew, made educated guesses about what they didn't, and labelled it all with the best terminology available. Tartary became their catch-all designation for the vast Asian interior, a word that described a real place, certainly, but through a lens of European uncertainty, approximation, and second-hand information. The maps document something genuine. The question is whether they document a political reality or simply European confusion about one. Every name carries history. Sometimes that history is straightforward, a city named for its founder, a mountain named for its shape. Other times, the history of a name reveals more about the people doing the naming than the place being named. The word Tartary begins with the Tatars. These were Turkic and Mongol peoples who dominated the Central Asian steppes for centuries. Medieval sources mention them repeatedly, particularly in connection with the Mongol conquests of the 13th century. When Genghis Khan's armies swept westward, devastating kingdoms from China to Eastern Europe, the soldiers and administrators of those armies included many Tatar groups. To Europeans experiencing these invasions, Tartar became synonymous with the conquering hordes that burned cities and redrew maps. But something curious happened to the name as it passed through European languages. Tartar became Tartar. Some scholars suggest this was simply linguistic drift, the kind of modification that happens naturally as words move between cultures. Others point to something more deliberate. In Greek mythology, Tartarus was the deepest abyss of the underworld, not merely the realm of the dead, but the prison beneath even Hades, where the most dangerous beings were confined a place of darkness and torment. The similarity between Tatar and Tartarus was not lost on medieval European writers. Some made the connection explicitly, describing the Mongol invaders as demons emerging from Tartarus itself, sent to punish Christendom for its sins. Whether the modification was intentional or coincidental, it carried weight. The word Tartar resonated with European fears in ways that Tartar did not. These weren't just foreign peoples, they were infernal forces, creatures from nightmare made flesh. You can trace this fear through medieval chronicles. Marco Polo writes of travelling through Tartary on his way to China, describing vast territories and strange customs. Papal envoys sent to negotiate with Mongol Khans return with reports about the Tartar Empire, trying to understand its power structure and whether it might be converted to Christianity, or at least persuaded not to invade. Crusader chronicles describe the Mongol invasions as the arrival of Tartar hordes, barbarians who threatened civilization itself. As centuries passed, something shifted. The term evolved from describing specific peoples to designating the geography they inhabited. By the 1600s, Tartary, on a map, might refer to lands controlled by Mongol descendants, or areas inhabited by Turkic peoples, or territories under nominal Chinese sovereignty but with local autonomy, or Russian-claimed Siberian regions, or simply unknown Central Asian spaces that needed a label. This created profound confusion. The same word could mean different things on different maps, to different cartographers, in different decades. A French geographer might use Tartary to describe regions inhabited by dozens of distinct ethnic groups. An English mapmaker might apply Tartary to territories governed by completely different political powers. A German atlas might show Tartary covering lands that another German atlas, published the same year, would subdivide entirely differently. The imprecision wasn't malicious. It reflected genuine European ignorance. Until Russian expansion into Siberia and Central Asia in the 18th and 19th centuries, until European powers gained direct access to these regions through colonial ambitions and exploratory missions, Western knowledge remained second-hand. It came from travelers who themselves often had limited understanding of the complex ethnic, political, and linguistic landscape they described. From merchants more interested in trade routes than cultural analysis. From missionaries focused on conversion rather than documentation. Here's what this reveals. Names on maps reflect the namer's understanding as much as the place is being named. Tartary was real, as geography the Asian interior exists, has always existed. But as a political or cultural entity, Tartary existed primarily in European imagination, a vast, vaguely understood space that cartographers labelled with a term borrowed from one group's name but applied broadly to many. A word that said more about European confusion than Asian reality. The question, then, isn't whether Tartary was real. It's what happened in those territories while Europeans were busy calling them by the wrong name. Behind every mystery, there's usually something real that got misunderstood. In the case of Tartary, that something was the Mongol Empire, and more importantly, what happened after it fell apart. The 13th century changed the world. Before Genghis Khan, the Mongol tribes were fragmented groups scattered across the eastern steppes, occasionally raiding settled civilizations, but never dominating them. Then came unification. Then came conquest on a scale that still defies easy comprehension. Within decades, Mongol armies moved across the steppes with devastating speed. They incorporated Turkic peoples into their ranks, subdued Chinese kingdoms, destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire so thoroughly that major cities never recovered, and pushed into Eastern Europe, defeating Polish and Hungarian forces before voluntarily withdrawing. By Genghis Khan's death in 1227, Mongol authority stretched from Korea to the Caspian Sea. It was the largest contiguous land empire in human history, a designation it still holds. What made this possible wasn't just military prowess, though the Mongol military system was remarkably sophisticated. It was organizational genius, efficient administration of conquered territories. brutal but effective intimidation tactics that made resistance seem futile, religious tolerance that allowed diverse peoples to coexist under Mongol rule, and exploitation of trade routes, connecting East and West in ways that enriched Mongol capitals and spread ideas across continents. But empires fragment. After Genghis Khan's death, his successors divided territories among themselves. The Mongol Empire became several khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China under Kublai Khan, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate across Central Asia, and the Golden Horde dominating the western steppes and exerting enormous influence over Russian principalities. These weren't mere administrative divisions. They were real, powerful states with sophisticated bureaucracies, cosmopolitan capitals, and distinct political trajectories. Each khanate eventually declined, but not simultaneously and not completely. The Yuan dynasty was expelled from China by the Ming in 1368, though Mongol rulers retreated to the northern steppes rather than disappearing. The Ilkhanate collapsed into smaller states throughout the 14th century. The Golden Horde fragmented into competing khanates: Crimean, Kazan, Astrakhan, Sibir by the 15th century. The Chagatai Khanate split into eastern and western portions, each pursuing independent paths. Here's what matters. These successor states didn't vanish. They persisted, evolved, and continued to shape Central Asian politics for centuries after the Mongol Empire's supposed end. The Crimean Khanate maintained independence until Russian annexation in 1783. That's the late 18th century, long after Europeans were confidently drawing Tartary on their maps. Various Uzbek Khanates controlled Central Asian oasis cities, Bukhara, Khiva, Kokand, well into the 19th century. The Dzungar Khanate, a powerful Mongol state, controlled vast territories across Central Asia until Qing conquest in the 1752. When European cartographers labelled regions as Tartary in the 16th through 18th centuries, they weren't inventing fantasy. They were referring, however, imperfectly, to these real political entities. The Crimean Khanate appeared on maps as part of Tartary. The Uzbek Khanates were often labelled Independent Tartary. The Dzungar territories showed up as Grand Tartary. The problem wasn't that nothing existed in these regions. The problem was that Europeans didn't know or couldn't easily communicate the actual names, borders, and political structures of dozens of distinct states. So they used a collective term. Tartary became shorthand for the fragmented but persistent legacy of the Mongol Empire. It was imprecise, certainly, misleading in its suggestion of unity where there was actually competition and division, but it wasn't pure fiction. This is what makes the Tartary question interesting. It's not about a vanished empire that left no trace. It's about real empires, multiple empires, actually that European knowledge systems couldn't adequately describe or distinguish. The Mongol legacy didn't disappear in the 14th century. It continued for 4 more centuries, governing territories, controlling trade routes, and influencing the political development of Asia. Europeans simply didn't have the language, knowledge, or cartographic conventions to represent this complexity accurately. They knew something powerful existed out there on the steppes. They called it Tartary. What they were actually looking at were the scattered but enduring pieces of the largest land empire the world had ever seen, still functioning, still governing, still shaping history just under names Europeans hadn't quite learned yet. If calling the region Tartary was imprecise, calling its inhabitants Tartars was even more so. The reality was infinitely more complex than any European map suggested. Consider the Turkic peoples alone. This linguistic family encompasses dozens of distinct groups: Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Turkmens, Uyghurs, Tatars, Yakuts, and many others. Within each group existed further divisions, different dialects, different customs, different political allegiances. Some were settled agriculturalists, tending gardens in oasis cities. Others were nomadic pastoralists, moving seasonally across vast grasslands. Still, others herded reindeer in Siberian forests. All spoke related but distinct languages. All maintained unique cultural practices. Then there were Mongolic peoples: Khalkha Mongols, Buryats, Kalmyks, Oirats, Tungusic peoples in eastern Siberia and Manchuria, Iranian groups like the Tajiks, smaller populations with their own languages and traditions that fit no broader category. Calling all of them Tartars was like calling all Europeans Romans. Because Latin-derived languages were spoken there, technically one thread connected them, but the label obscured everything that actually mattered. These peoples organized their lives in fundamentally different ways from European societies, which made understanding them difficult. Pastoral nomadism required seasonal migration between summer and winter pastures. Populations moved across territories larger than entire European kingdoms, following patterns established over generations. Horse culture wasn't just transportation. It was the foundation of military power, social status, and economic organization. Oasis agriculture created permanent settlements in Central Asian cities where Silk Road trade flourished. These weren't primitive societies stumbling through history. They were sophisticated cultures, adapted brilliantly to environments that would have broken European agricultural systems. Political unity came and went. Sometimes a powerful leader like Genghis Khan unified disparate tribes into a single formidable force. More often, the region fragmented into competing khanates and tribal confederations, their alliances shifting through marriage, conquest, treaty, and betrayal. Migration patterns changed. Cultural exchange occurred constantly at borders and trading posts. The political map was never static. Religious diversity added another layer. Many steppe peoples maintained shamanic and animistic traditions, their spiritual practices tied to the land and animals they depended on. Islam spread throughout Central Asia, following Arab conquests, eventually dominating settled populations and many nomadic groups. Buddhist influence shaped Mongolia and regions bordering Tibet. In practice, many communities blended these traditions into complex syncretic beliefs that defied simple categorization. Europeans failed to grasp this complexity for understandable reasons. Direct contact with most of these peoples was limited or non-existent. Language barriers made distinction difficult. How do you differentiate between groups when you can't speak to them or read their own accounts of themselves? There was a natural human tendency to simplify, to group unfamiliar peoples into broad categories that made sense from a distance. And there was genuine difficulty mapping fluid, nomadic populations whose political affiliations changed more rapidly than European printing presses could produce updated atlases. So Tartary became a catch-all, a convenient label for vast regions that clearly existed and clearly held populations but whose specific ethnic, linguistic, and political characteristics remained uncertain. Rather than admit ignorance, rather than leave regions blank or marked with question marks, cartographers gave them a name. That name suggested knowledge while actually obscuring its absence. Compare this to how Europeans mapped their own continent. French, German, Italian, Spanish, Polish, Hungarian. Each group appeared on maps with precise labels, distinct territories, clear borders. European cartographers understood that Bavarians and Saxons were different, despite both being German. That Castilians and Catalans had distinct identities despite sharing the Iberian Peninsula. European maps showed sophisticated ethnic, linguistic, and political distinctions because cartographers possessed sophisticated knowledge. Central Asia deserved the same careful attention. It contained comparable diversity, arguably more, given the vast territories involved. But European knowledge wasn't sophisticated enough to map that diversity accurately, so they simplified. They labeled. They created the impression of understanding while actually demonstrating its absence. The mystery isn't that Tartary existed. The mystery is how hundreds of distinct peoples with rich histories became collapsed into a single European word that told you almost nothing about who they actually were. Political power on the Central Asian steppes didn't work the way it worked in Europe. This fundamental difference made accurate mapping nearly impossible. Consider what a European state meant in the 17th or 18th century. France had borders, actual surveyed lines where French authority ended and Spanish or imperial authority began. The King of France ruled everyone within those borders, collected taxes from defined territories, and enforced laws through a bureaucratic system that reached into every province. Borders might shift through war or treaty, but at any given moment, a reasonably accurate map could show where France was. Now consider the Kazakh Khanate, which appeared on European maps as part of Tartary. It wasn't one unified state. It was three distinct hordes: senior, middle, and junior, each with separate leadership and territories. Sometimes they cooperated. Sometimes they competed. The borders between their ranges weren't fixed lines, but fluid zones where allegiance shifted seasonally. A Khan's power extended to those who acknowledged him, not necessarily to all people in a geographic area. During summer migrations, different hordes might occupy the same pastures their rivals used in winter. The Crimean Khanate functioned differently still. Nominally a vassal to the Ottoman Empire, it maintained significant autonomy, conducting its own raids and diplomacy. The Khanates of Bukhara and Khiva controlled important Silk Road cities, but competed for influence over surrounding tribal groups, whose loyalty was never guaranteed. The Khanate of Kokand emerged in the Fergana Valley in the 18th century, carving out territory from lands previously claimed by others. The Dzungar Khanate, the last great Mongol empire, controlled vast Central Asian territories until Qing conquest in the 1752. Tribal and clan loyalties cut across all these political boundaries. A person's identity came from lineage and confederation as much as from geographic location. Control could be seasonal. Different powers might dominate the same territory at different times of year based on migration patterns and military campaigns. This made European-style mapping essentially impossible. Cartographers were trained to draw fixed borders between permanent states. But Central Asian political reality didn't fit that model. Borders were zones, not lines. Authority was personal and fluid, not territorial and fixed. Alliances shifted. New khanates emerged, while others collapsed or were absorbed by neighbors. The map that accurately represented political control in 1700 might be completely wrong by 1720. Meanwhile, larger empires complicated everything further. The Qing dynasty claimed authority over vast regions it labeled Chinese Tartary, Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Tibet, though actual control varied enormously by location and period. The Russian Empire expanded steadily eastward and southward, gradually absorbing khanates and incorporating them into its growing territory. The Ottoman Empire exercised influence over Western Turkic peoples. Safavid and later Qajar Persia disputed border regions with Central Asian khanates, who controlled what and when and to what degree. European cartographers faced an impossible task. They needed to produce maps that showed something in these vast regions. Blank spaces suggested ignorance and looked unprofessional. But tracking the intricate, constantly changing political landscape required better intelligence than they possessed. So they simplified. Tartary and its subdivisions, Grand, Chinese, Independent, Muscovite, Tibetan, captured the general idea while avoiding detailed claims that would quickly become obsolete. This created a profound historical distortion. European readers of maps and geographical texts gained the impression of a stable, unified political landscape. The label Tartary suggested coherence, where fragmentation actually existed. The sophistication of Central Asian political systems, the complex negotiations, the sophisticated diplomatic relationships, the intricate balance of tribal and state authority, all of this was flattened into neat borders and simple names. The mystery of Tartary isn't that a unified empire existed and was somehow erased from history. The mystery is that European knowledge was too limited to accurately represent a complex, fluid political landscape. So they created a simplification, gave it a name borrowed from one group of peoples, and applied it to territories they knew existed but couldn't precisely characterize. The real history was always there, playing out in countless khanates and tribal confederations. Europeans just couldn't see it clearly enough to map it properly. Every map begins with someone who actually went there. For European cartographers trying to understand Central Asia, that meant relying on travelers who'd made journeys most people considered impossible. Marco Polo is the name everyone remembers. In 1271, he left Venice with his father and uncle, traveling overland through Persia, along the Silk Road, into the heart of what Europeans would later call Tartary. He spent 17 years in service to Kublai Khan, witnessing the Mongol Empire at the height of its power and sophistication. When he returned in 1295, his stories seemed too extraordinary to believe. Cities larger than any in Europe, postal systems spanning continents, administrative organizations more efficient than European kingdoms, wealth on scales that made Venice look provincial. His account, dictated while imprisoned after a naval battle, became one of the most influential books in European history. For centuries, it shaped how Europeans imagined Asia. Cartographers extracted place names from his descriptions, tried to calculate distances from his travel times, and mapped the political geography of the Mongol Empire based on his observations. But there was a problem. Polo described the empire as it existed in the 1,270 seconds and 1,280 seconds, a vast, unified state under strong central authority. By the time his accounts circulated widely in Europe and influenced cartographers, that empire had fractured into competing khanates. The political reality he documented was already historical. Yet maps continued to depict Central Asia based on his observations, applying 13th century information to 16th century geography. Polo wasn't the only source. Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, a Franciscan friar, reached the Mongol court in 1246, sent by the Pope to gather intelligence about these terrifying invaders who devastated Eastern Europe. His report provided the first detailed European assessment of Mongol military capabilities, political organization, and expansion plans. William of Rubruck followed in the 1250 seconds, another Franciscan envoy whose ethnographic observations described daily life, religious practices, and social structures with remarkable detail. Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan traveller, crossed Central Asia in the 14th century, his accounts providing Islamic world perspectives that occasionally reached European scholars through translation and exchange. Each traveller contributed fragments of understanding route descriptions, city names, observations about peoples and customs, assessments of political power. These accounts shaped European imagination powerfully. They confirmed that vast empires existed beyond Europe's eastern frontier. They provided partial geographical knowledge that cartographers desperately wanted. They described peoples Europeans lumped together as Tartars, with observations that mixed accurate detail and cultural misunderstanding. And they created an image of Central Asia as exotic, wealthy, sophisticated, and vaguely threatening a place of marvels and dangers. But information degrades as it travels. These accounts were copied by hand, translated between languages, embellished by scribes who thought they were improving the narrative, and sometimes corrupted through simple copying errors. A traveller's observation from one period might be applied to later situations where it no longer fit. Geographical references were often maddeningly imprecise. Travelled for many days doesn't help a cartographer calculate exact distances. Fantastic elements crept in, whether original embellishments or later additions, mixing with genuine observation until separating fact from fantasy became nearly impossible. European scholars and cartographers did what they could with these sources. They extracted geographical information, placing names and features on maps based on descriptions that might or might not be accurate. They tried reconciling contradictory accounts from different periods, different routes, different travelers, with different purposes and biases. They filled gaps with educated speculation, and they applied European organizational frameworks to descriptions of Central Asian systems that operated on fundamentally different principles. Cities Marco Polo described appeared on maps for centuries, sometimes in approximately correct locations, sometimes wildly misplaced because distance calculations were wrong or because cartographers misunderstood which routes he'd taken. References to Tartar peoples and lands were generalized to label vast regions. Political entities, travelers described, continued appearing on maps long after they'd transformed or disappeared entirely. The knowledge was real. The travelers genuinely went to these places and documented what they saw. But that knowledge was fragmentary, often outdated before it even reached Europe, imperfectly understood by people who'd never experienced the cultures being described, and filtered through assumptions that sometimes clarified and sometimes distorted reality. European maps of Tartary captured partial truths about a complex reality. The question was always which parts were true and which were educated guesses filling the gaps. Famous travelers made the best stories, but merchants provided the practical knowledge. For centuries, the Silk Road wasn't one path but a network of trade routes connecting Mediterranean Europe with China, India, and East Asia, passing directly through the regions Europeans would label Tartary. The name Silk Road is romantic but misleading. No single merchant traveled the entire distance from China to Europe. Instead, goods passed through multiple hands, exchanged at oases, cities, and trading centers throughout Central Asia. Silk from China, yes, but also spices from India and Southeast Asia, precious metals and gems, horses from Central Asian steppes renowned for their quality, and alongside these material goods, ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that traveled the same routes. Most merchants specialized in particular segments. A trader from Samarkand knew the routes to Kashgar and Bukhara intimately, but might never see the Mediterranean. A Venetian merchant maintained contacts in Black Sea ports, but relied on Central Asian intermediaries for goods from further east. Armenian merchant networks served as bridges between Islamic Central Asia and Christian Europe, their cultural position allowing them to operate across religious boundaries. This created something valuable: a continuous flow of practical information. Merchants needed to know which routes were safe, which cities offered the best prices, which rulers demanded reasonable tolls, and which were essentially running protection rackets. Trading communities in Central Asian cities included people from various cultures, sharing intelligence about political changes, bandit activity, drought, or abundance affecting supply. That commercial intelligence traveled back to European merchant communities, providing updates more current than accounts from famous travelers decades or centuries earlier. Venetian and Genoese traders maintained contacts in Black Sea ports, and some ventured into Central Asia proper. Russian merchants pushed eastward as Muscovite Russia expanded, encountering new peoples and markets. These commercial relationships generated geographical knowledge as a practical byproduct. Not comprehensive knowledge, merchants cared about trade routes and cities, leaving vast territories between known only vaguely. Not scholarly knowledge, most merchants had limited interest in ethnography, politics, or culture beyond what affected their business. Sometimes, secret knowledge, valuable route information, wasn't always widely shared when commercial advantage depended on exclusive access. But it was current knowledge, which mattered enormously for cartography. Maps based on active trade could show routes with reasonable accuracy. Economic intelligence indicated which regions were stable, wealthy, or dangerous. Regular contact meant European understanding could evolve somewhat as political conditions changed, rather than remaining frozen based on outdated sources. Then the routes shifted. The Mongol Empire's fragmentation disrupted some trade paths, making formerly safe routes hazardous. Ottoman expansion in the 15th and 16th centuries complicated European access to overland routes, adding political barriers and intermediaries. Development of maritime routes to Asia, Portuguese ships rounding Africa, later Dutch and English vessels, reduced overland trade's importance. European merchants found it easier and more profitable to sail around continents than cross them by land. As direct contact decreased, knowledge degraded. The practical intelligence that had grounded European understanding in contemporary reality stopped flowing. Cartographers were left mapping from memory, drawing borders based on accounts that grew more outdated every year. Yet the maps didn't show increasing uncertainty. If anything, they showed greater confidence, more detailed labels, more precise borders, more elaborate subdivisions of Tartary into Grand, Chinese, Independent, and other categories. This created a peculiar paradox. Earlier European knowledge, when Silk Road trade was active, was more current, even if fragmentary. Later knowledge, as cartographers produced increasingly elaborate maps, was actually less reliable because it relied on outdated sources. The apparent improvement in cartographic sophistication masked a decline in actual understanding. Commercial connections had provided real information that grounded Tartary in reality. Merchants had walked those routes, slept in those caravanserais, negotiated with those rulers. But as economic incentives shifted and maritime trade replaced overland routes, that foundation eroded. The name remained on maps, the borders were drawn with confident lines, but the knowledge supporting those cartographic decisions grew thinner with each passing generation. Europeans were mapping a region they'd once known but were gradually forgetting. Commerce moved goods. Diplomacy moved information of a different kind. Political intelligence about who ruled where, who commanded armies, who could be allied with, or needed to be feared. European powers sent envoys to Central Asian rulers from the earliest periods of contact. The 13th century missions to Mongol courts weren't just religious curiosity, they were intelligence gathering. Popes and kings needed to understand these terrifying invaders, their military capabilities, their political structures, their intentions toward Christian Europe. Were they potential allies against Muslim powers? Were negotiations even possible with rulers who seemed to operate by completely different diplomatic rules? The envoys returned with written reports that became source material for scholars and cartographers. These documents described military organizations in detail that traders wouldn't have noticed. They documented court protocols and power hierarchies. They attempted to map the command structure of empires whose political organization didn't match European templates. Russian diplomatic expansion provided particularly important intelligence. As Muscovite Russia pushed eastward and southward, it encountered numerous Tatar and Central Asian khanates. Some were conquered militarily. Others were brought under Russian influence through negotiation and alliance. Russian envoys to Siberian, Kazakh, and Central Asian rulers generated reports describing peoples, resources, political conditions, and the complex relationships between competing khanates. This intelligence gradually made its way to Western Europe through various channels, diplomatic exchanges, German scholars working in Russian service, published accounts that circulated among geographical societies. Diplomatic reports differed from traveller accounts in crucial ways. Envoys had official status requiring more systematic observation and reporting. Political and military intelligence was often more detailed and current because diplomatic missions responded to specific political situations. But diplomatic sources carried their own biases. The political goals of the mission coloured what was observed and how it was interpreted. And much diplomatic intelligence remained government secrets, rather than entering public knowledge where cartographers could access it. Russian negotiations with Kazakh Khans in the 17th and 18th centuries documented the complex relationships between the three Kazakh hordes, their distinct territories, their separate leaderships, their sometimes cooperative and sometimes antagonistic relationships with each other, and with Russian expansion. Ottoman diplomatic contacts with Crimean and other Turkic Khanates provided information that sometimes reached European rivals through espionage or captured documents. Qing dynasty interactions with Mongol and Central Asian states were occasionally documented in Jesuit reports from the Chinese court, offering Chinese imperial perspectives to European readers. This diplomatic intelligence shaped cartography directly. Political boundaries on maps often reflected diplomatic understandings of spheres of influence, rather than actual territorial control. Labels like independent Tartary indicated regions where no major power had established clear authority, diplomatically significant, precisely because they remained outside the major imperial systems. As Russian Empire expanded, maps increasingly showed Russian Tartary, or incorporated former Tartary regions into Russian administrative divisions. The 18th and 19th centuries brought transition. European knowledge of Central Asia shifted from fragmentary second-hand accounts to more direct information via Russian sources. This provided better intelligence, but also meant European understanding became filtered through Russian imperial perspectives. What had been mysterious Tartary was gradually subdivided into specific territories, with Russian administrative names, governorates, provinces, regions defined by the expanding empire's bureaucratic organization. This explains Tartary's disappearance more convincingly than any conspiracy. The term wasn't erased. It was replaced by more specific, accurate knowledge as direct European contact increased. Why call it Tartary when you could specify Kazakh Steppe, Siberian Gubernia, Xinjiang province? Better information revealed the political fragmentation that Tartary had obscured, making the umbrella term less useful. As Russian diplomatic and military control extended across these regions, the vague geographical designation gave way to precise administrative geography. Diplomatic expansion made the mystery concrete. The vast, uncertain Tartary resolved into dozens of distinct territories with known borders, documented populations, and established governments. Not because some hidden empire was destroyed, but because ignorance was gradually replaced by knowledge. The name faded not because what it described vanished, but because Europeans finally learned enough to call things by their actual names. Imagine you're a cartographer in Amsterdam, 1688. Your workshop smells of ink and sizing compound, paper stretched to dry on wooden frames. You've been commissioned to produce a map of Asia, something comprehensive, beautiful, authoritative, enough to command a premium price from wealthy collectors or institutions. You have sources, Ptolemy's ancient geography, though you know much of it is wrong. Marco Polo's account, 2 translations available with conflicting details. Recent travellers' reports, some contradictory. Other cartographers' maps, your competitors' work that you'll study carefully, copying what seems reliable, correcting what seems wrong. Astronomical observations that can establish latitude reasonably well, though longitude remains frustratingly uncertain, and vast regions about which you have almost nothing reliable. The commission requires a complete map, not a map that honestly shows huge blank spaces labelled "We don't know." A map that looks finished, authoritative, suitable for display. This is your livelihood. The more impressive your work appears, the more likely prestigious buyers will commission future projects. So you make decisions. Coastal Asia, you can map with confidence. Maritime exploration has verified those shorelines repeatedly. Cities connected by major trade routes appear in multiple sources with rough agreement on locations. Political boundaries in regions with regular European contact can be drawn with reasonable accuracy. Then you reach Central Asia, the region travelers call Tartary. Your sources become sparse and contradictory. One account describes mountain ranges, another never mentions. Place names appear in forms so varied you're not certain they reference the same location. Distances are given in travel time, many days' journey, which tells you almost nothing useful for calculating actual geography. The political situation described in your best source is decades old and might have changed completely. You have several options for handling this uncertainty. You could be honest, marking vast areas terra incognita, unknown lands. Some cartographers do this. It's intellectually respectable. It's also commercially problematic. Maps with huge blank spaces look incomplete, unimpressive. Buyers want comprehensive coverage. You could speculate based on fragmentary information. If one traveler mentions mountains in the north, you could draw a mountain range there, rendered in your careful style, so it looks as authoritative as mountains you've actually verified. If another describes a river flowing eastward, you add it to your map, though you're guessing about its course, its size, its relation to other features. You could fill empty spaces decoratively. Illustrations of camels crossing steppes, tents suggesting nomadic peoples, exotic animals mentioned in travelers' accounts. These aren't geographical information, but they demonstrate you've consulted sources about the region. They fill space impressively. Or you could copy earlier maps. If Mercator or Ortelius respected cartographers whose work established standards depicted Tartary a certain way, you could follow their lead. This perpetuates their errors if they were wrong, but it also means you're working within established geographical consensus. There's safety in that. Most likely, you do all of these. You mark some areas honestly as uncertain. You speculate where fragmentary information allows. You add decorative elements where blank space becomes too obvious. You copy respected predecessors when their work seems reasonable and you have nothing better. You label the vast central region Tartary, or subdivide it Grand Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, based on political categories you've encountered in sources. Even though you're uncertain about precise boundaries or current accuracy, the labels themselves acknowledge limited knowledge. You're categorizing a region you can't map with precision. The finished product is beautiful. Your engraving is precise, your calligraphy elegant. Coastal regions show dense information, hundreds of place names, detailed river systems, careful political boundaries. Then you reach Tartary, and suddenly there are vast spaces, speculative mountain ranges, perhaps a dozen place names scattered across territory larger than Western Europe. The aesthetic consistency masks dramatic variations in knowledge quality. Users of your map won't necessarily recognize this unless they're sophisticated about cartographic conventions. The confident lines, the authoritative labels, the impressive overall presentation suggest comprehensive knowledge. Only those who understand the visual language of uncertainty, the sparse detail, the blank spaces, the qualifier notes tucked in margins will recognize you're admitting in the language of maps. Here I'm guessing. This was map-making in the age of exploration. Beautiful, impressive, commercially successful and honest about its limitations if you knew how to read it. Understanding old maps requires recognizing them as documents displaying both knowledge and ignorance, information and educated speculation, carefully balanced to satisfy truth and commerce simultaneously. Some maps become templates. Their depictions, whether accurate or not, establish conventions that later cartographers copy, modify, or struggle against. Understanding how Europeans imagined Tartary requires examining the specific influential maps that shaped that imagination. Abraham Ortelius published his Theatrum Orbis Terrarum in 1571 of the first modern atlases, a comprehensive work collecting the best geographical knowledge available. His map showed Tartaria sprawling across Central Asia in confident letters. The work's prestige was enormous. Ortelius had synthesized classical sources and contemporary reports, organizing them systematically. When later cartographers needed to depict Asia, they consulted Ortelius as authoritative reference. His conventions for showing Tartary how it was subdivided, where boundaries were drawn, which place names appeared, persisted for decades because he'd established the standard. Gerardus Mercator's work carried similar authority. His 1569 projection revolutionized navigation, and his atlas published in the 1590 seconds represented sophisticated geographical thinking. Mercator divided Tartary into regions based on his understanding of different peoples and political entities. His maps showed impressive compilation of available sources, alongside significant blank areas, where he honestly acknowledged uncertainty. His reputation for scientific rigor meant his geographical claims were taken seriously. If Mercator drew a boundary or placed a mountain range somewhere, later mapmakers needed good reason to contradict him. The Bleu family's atlases represented the pinnacle of Dutch Golden Age cartography. Willem and Joan Bleu produced elaborate, multi-volume works that were as much art objects as geographical references. Their maps combined information with decorative elements, illustrated peoples, cities, activities that made the maps visually stunning. They subdivided Tartary increasingly as more information became available, showing Grand Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Muscovite Tartary as distinct regions. Their commercial success was extraordinary. Wealthy collectors across Europe purchased Bleu atlases. This meant their depictions circulated widely, shaping how educated Europeans mentally organized Asian geography. French cartographers brought new rigor in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Guillaume de Lille and Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville pioneered more critical evaluation of sources. They questioned earlier maps, corrected errors when better information appeared, and acknowledged uncertainty more explicitly in marginal notes. D'Anville particularly benefited from Jesuit reports from China and Russian geographical surveys. His maps began showing Tartary's fragmentation. Russian territories clearly distinguished from Chinese territories, independent Tartary, shrinking as surrounding empires expanded. His 1,730 maps represented the most accurate depictions available to Europeans, based on the best contemporary intelligence. But here's the interesting part. D'Anville's maps were still being copied and consulted for decades afterward. In 1834, cartographers produced maps based on his work that was over a century old by then. For generations, European understanding of Central Asia relied on one man's careful but ultimately limited synthesis of sources that were already somewhat dated when he consulted them. This reveals how geographical knowledge propagated unevenly. Specialists with access to new information understood the region more accurately. But popular understanding, the mental maps ordinary educated people carried, was based on whatever atlases they'd seen, which were often older works, reprints, or copies of established cartographers' efforts. Beautiful, outdated maps outsold plain accurate ones. Aesthetic appeal mattered commercially as much as precision. Watching these maps evolve shows the pattern clearly. Early maps showed vague Tartaria with minimal internal detail. Mid-period maps subdivided it into specific regions. Later maps increasingly replaced Tartary labels with names of peoples, territories, or administrative regions. By the 19th century, serious cartographers had largely abandoned Tartary, except as historical reference. The evolution tracked European knowledge acquisition from uncertainty to specificity, from speculation to verified information. But that evolution took time. Old maps persisted. They sat in libraries, were consulted by scholars, influenced artistic and literary representations of Central Asia. Even as cutting-edge geography moved beyond Tartary, the name remained embedded in educated consciousness because the maps that showed it were so beautiful, so authoritative-looking, so widely distributed. The geography changed not because the land changed, but because finally Europeans knew enough to call it by more accurate names. Unknown territories don't remain unknown forever. Someone eventually goes there, maps it, claims it, or at minimum learns its actual name. For the regions Europeans called Tartary, that process accelerated dramatically in the 18th and 19th centuries. Russian expansion drove much of it. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, Russian forts appeared steadily eastward across Siberia. The Russian Empire extracted tribute from native peoples, established administrative control, and organized territories into gubernii provinces with governors, bureaucracies, tax systems. As Russia extended authority across regions previously labeled Siberian Tartary or Russian Tartary, maps began showing those Russian administrative divisions instead. Vague geographical designations gave way to specific provincial names. Russian geographical surveys, often involving European scientists hired by the imperial government, provided detailed information that entered European cartographic knowledge through academic networks and published accounts. The Qing dynasty shaped the map from the east. In the 1752, Qing military campaigns destroyed the Dzungar Khanate, bringing vast Central Asian territories under Chinese control. Mongolia, Xinjiang, Tibet regions, Europeans had often included in Chinese Tartary or Grand Tartary, became integrated into Qing administrative structures. Jesuit missionaries at the Qing court, particularly active in the 17th and 18th centuries, transmitted Chinese geographical knowledge to Europe. Maps improved, showing not vague Chinese Tartary, but specific Chinese provinces and dependencies with proper names. Then came the great game, that 19th century geopolitical competition between British and Russian empires for influence across Central Asia. British concern about Russian expansion toward India drove intensive intelligence gathering. British officers explored regions previously known to Europeans only through fragmentary accounts. Russian explorers and military expeditions mapped territories between Russia and British India with strategic precision. This competitive exploration filled in blanks remarkably quickly. By mid-century, regions that had been labelled independent Tartary, supposedly beyond any major power's control, were precisely mapped, their khanates documented, their resources catalogued, their strategic importance assessed. Watch the language on maps shift accordingly. Early 19th century maps sometimes still showed Tartary in titles or as historical reference. Mid-19th century maps increasingly used specific ethnic or geographical names: Kazakh steppe, Kyrgyz lands, Turkestan, Mongolia. By late 19th century, Tartary had essentially disappeared except in historical context. Modern names replaced the archaic European designation. This represented more than semantic change. It marked the replacement of a European-imposed label with more accurate nomenclature reflecting actual peoples and regions. The transition from uncertainty to colonial knowledge. Information became detailed, systematic, filtered through imperial perspectives, certainly, but far more comprehensive than fragmentary traveller accounts from previous centuries. There's irony here. As Tartary disappeared from maps, European control or influence over the regions it had labelled increased dramatically. The name vanished not because the territories became less important, but because they became too well known, too thoroughly explored, and claimed to remain mysterious. Russian governors administered what had been Russian Tartary. British intelligence officers mapped what had been independent Tartary. Chinese officials governed what had been Chinese Tartary. The vague designation became obsolete because, finally, after centuries, these regions were known, named, and mostly incorporated into one empire or another. This explains Tartary's disappearance without conspiracy. It wasn't erased by coordinated historical revisionism. It was replaced by more specific, accurate knowledge as direct contact increased, exploration filled in unknown areas, and the geopolitical situation changed from mysterious, distant lands to territories thoroughly mapped and claimed by imperial powers. The process was gradual but inexorable. Each expedition, each survey, each administrative reorganization added detail that made the old vague labels less useful. By 1900, you could pull an atlas from any major library and find detailed maps showing Central Asia with precision Ortelius or Mercator could never have achieved. Railroads crossed regions once thought impassable. Telegraph lines connected cities once weeks apart by caravan. Administrative boundaries divided territories once loosely organized by tribal allegiance. The geography itself hadn't changed. Human knowledge of it had changed completely, and with that knowledge came new names, new categories, new ways of organizing the map that made Tartary seem like a quaint historical footnote rather than current geographical designation. Something happened to Tartary on the internet. Somewhere between forgotten geographical designation and present day, it transformed into something else entirely. A conspiracy theory about a hidden empire, advanced technology, and deliberate historical erasure. The story goes like this. Tartary wasn't just a vague European label for poorly understood Asian territories. It was a real unified empire spanning Eurasia. This empire possessed advanced technology, particularly in architecture and possibly energy systems. It was destroyed in a catastrophic event, often claimed to be massive mud floods in the 18th or 19th centuries. Evidence of this empire was systematically destroyed or hidden by those who conquered it, and the ornate 19th century buildings you see in cities across Russia, Europe and North America, those aren't 19th century constructions at all. They're leftover Tartarian architecture, claimed by later societies who rewrote history to credit themselves. It's a compelling narrative, hidden truth, cover-up, a sophisticated civilization deliberately erased from collective memory. The appeal is obvious. These ideas emerged primarily in the 2010 seconds, spreading through internet communities on YouTube, Reddit, and various conspiracy-focused forums. They didn't appear from nowhere. They drew on earlier alternative history, traditions, catastrophism, claims of advanced ancient civilizations like Atlantis, and a general suspicion that mainstream historical narratives hide important truths. But the internet changed everything. The participatory nature of online culture meant people could collectively build elaborate theories through shared research and speculation. One person notices old maps showing Tartary. Another finds ornate buildings they think look too sophisticated for their supposed construction date. Someone else discovers photographs of partially buried structures. Piece by piece, through forum discussions and video compilations, a theory takes shape. The evidence cited seems substantial at first glance. Old maps definitely show Tartary. We've spent several chapters examining them. Ornate 19th century architecture genuinely is impressive, particularly World's Fair buildings and civic structures in cities from St. Petersburg to Chicago. Historical records do have gaps, they always do. And photographs from the late 19th and early 20th centuries do show buildings with basement windows at street level or partially below ground. But context changes everything. Maps showed Tartary, yes, but as a geographical designation for real regions, Europeans understood poorly, not as documentation of a unified empire. Ornate 19th century architecture was built by documented architects, using well-understood techniques. We have construction records, budgets, contemporary newspaper accounts, photographs of buildings under construction. The architects are known. Their training is documented. The workers who built these structures left payroll records, union documentation, sometimes even personal accounts of construction projects. Historical gaps reflect normal limitations of record-keeping and preservation, not conspiracy. Records are lost to fire, flood, war, simple neglect. Some things were never recorded in the first place because they seemed unimportant at the time. This is true of all historical periods and regions. And those photographs of partially buried buildings, they show common urban phenomena. Cities frequently raised street grades during modernization, particularly when installing underground sewer systems. Urban flooding was common in low-lying areas before modern drainage. Debris accumulated over time, gradually raising ground levels around older structures. What conspiracy theorists call evidence of catastrophic mud floods destroying an advanced civilization are actually ordinary events with documented mundane explanations. The theory gained traction for understandable reasons. It offered explanations for things people found puzzling. Why don't we learn about Tartary in school? Why do old maps show it if it wasn't important? How did people in the 19th century build such elaborate structures? It provided community, a shared interest connecting people across the internet. It resonated with broader cultural distrust of institutions and official narratives, and it allowed participants to feel they possessed special knowledge, that they'd figured out something mainstream historians missed or deliberately hid. Social media algorithms amplified everything. Content-generating engagement, likes, shares, comments, watch time, got promoted regardless of accuracy. Algorithmic recommendations led people from initial curiosity about historical maps to increasingly extreme claims about hidden empires and global conspiracies. The collaborative nature of theory building created emotional investment in the narrative beyond rational evaluation of evidence. The underlying questions are legitimate. Why did Tartary appear on maps? Why don't more people know about it? These are good questions deserving real answers. The problem isn't the curiosity. The problem is when genuine historical complexity gets transformed into unfounded claims about advanced, lost civilizations and deliberate historical cover-ups. The actual history, European cartographic practices, Central Asian political fragmentation, the evolution of geographical knowledge, is interesting enough, without inventing empires that never existed. Humans have always been drawn to stories about lost civilizations. Atlantis, Lemuria, Mu, ancient Egyptians supposedly having electricity, advanced pre-flood cultures. The specifics change, but the pattern persists across cultures and centuries. We want to believe that before us, others achieved greatness and then vanished, leaving only traces for clever observers to discover. The appeal operates on several levels. We're pattern-seeking creatures. Meaninglessness makes us uncomfortable. When we encounter something, we find puzzling ornate architecture, old maps with unfamiliar names, gaps in narratives we've been taught. Our minds want explanations. Conspiracy theories provide comprehensive frameworks. Everything connects. Every anomaly fits into a grand narrative. That's psychologically satisfying even when it's factually wrong. Possessing secret knowledge creates powerful feelings. You've figured out something others haven't. You're questioning rather than accepting. You're informed rather than ignorant. These feelings are rewarding regardless of whether the knowledge is actually true. The emotional satisfaction comes from the sense of insight, of being one of the people who sees through official stories to hidden reality underneath. Lost civilization narratives offer specific appeals. They suggest human history is more interesting, more mysterious than conventional narratives acknowledge. They position believers as thoughtful questioners rather than passive students memorizing approved facts. They create community among people sharing interest in alternative histories. And they offer explanatory power, that building is too beautiful for its supposed construction date, therefore it must be from an earlier, more advanced civilization. Architecture features prominently in Tartarian theories for understandable reasons. Ornate 19th century buildings genuinely are impressive. Many people find it difficult to believe they were built in the time frames and with the technologies of their period. Modern architecture, being more utilitarian, creates nostalgia for elaborate earlier styles. Why don't we build like that anymore? And most people lack detailed understanding of pre-modern construction techniques, making historical building achievements seem more mysterious than they actually are to specialists. Institutional distrust amplifies everything. Trust in governments, media, and academic institutions has declined significantly in recent decades. When official sources are perceived as biased or dishonest about some things, and they sometimes are, it becomes easier to believe they're hiding other things. Conspiracy theories create inverted trust structures. You stop trusting mainstream authorities and start trusting alternative sources and fellow believers instead. The logic becomes, if they lied about this, maybe they're lying about everything. There's an aesthetic judgment component that's often overlooked. Some people genuinely believe ornate 19th century architecture is too beautiful or too sophisticated for its period. This reflects more about contemporary architectural tastes than about historical capabilities. Not understanding how something was accomplished can feel like evidence it wasn't accomplished according to the official narrative. The gap between what you can imagine being possible and what actually was possible gets filled with alternative explanations. Conspiracy theories also offer democratic appeal. You don't need formal education or academic credentials to participate. Anyone with internet access can become a researcher. This democratization appeals to people who feel excluded from scholarly discussions. But it also means expertise and evidence evaluation matter less than compelling narrative and community consensus. A well-edited YouTube video can seem more authoritative than a carefully researched academic paper because it's more engaging, more accessible, more emotionally satisfying. Tartary works particularly well as conspiracy focus because it was real. It appeared on actual historical maps, providing a legitimate starting point. Most people hadn't heard of it, making it seem like hidden knowledge. The name itself sounds exotic and mysterious, and enough genuine historical complexity exists around Central Asian history that cherry-picked facts can seem to support alternative narratives if you're not careful about context and competing evidence. YouTube and visual media accelerated everything. Historical photographs and maps are inherently compelling. Video allows detailed examination of architectural features. Algorithmic recommendations lead viewers from legitimate historical content to conspiracy theories seamlessly. And the production quality of some conspiracy content rivals or exceeds educational content, lending spurious authority to false claims. This reveals something about contemporary culture: hunger for meaning in fragmented information landscapes, distrust of traditional authorities, desire for community and shared purpose, fascination with the possibility that official history might be incomplete or wrong. These are human needs. They're not going away. The question is whether they lead toward genuine understanding or away from it. Let's examine what conspiracy theorists actually point to as evidence, because these claims deserve serious responses. The most common claim involves ornate 19th century architecture. Buildings from this period, Beaux-Arts style, Second Empire, Victorian Gothic, are indeed elaborate and impressive. Conspiracy theorists argue they're too sophisticated for their supposed construction date. Therefore, they must be remnants of an advanced Tartarian civilization. But we know exactly who built these buildings. The architects are documented. Charles Garnier designed the Paris Opera. Richard Morris Hunt designed the base of the Statue of Liberty and multiple Gilded Age mansions. Cass Gilbert designed the Woolworth Building. We have their training records, their correspondence, their architectural drawings. We have construction budgets showing exactly how much was spent on materials and labor. Contemporary newspapers documented construction progress. Photographs show these buildings being erected, not excavated. The construction techniques, while labor-intensive, used well-understood principles. The Industrial Revolution had made iron and steel widely available. Steam-powered machinery enabled moving heavy materials. Improvements in cement and concrete technology expanded architectural possibilities. Large workforces of skilled craftsmen existed, trained through generations-old apprenticeship systems. Elaborate decoration required skilled sculptors and artisans whose work is documented in guild records, payrolls, and sometimes their own memoirs. It was labor-intensive, yes. Technologically mysterious, no. The mud flood claims about partially buried buildings reflect misunderstanding of urban development. Cities raised street grades frequently during 19th and early 20th century modernization, particularly when installing underground utilities like sewer systems. What is now a basement was sometimes originally ground level until the city raised the street around it. Urban flooding was common in low-lying areas before modern drainage systems. Debris accumulated over decades, gradually raising ground levels. These are ordinary urban phenomena with documented, mundane explanations, not evidence of catastrophic events destroying advanced civilizations. Old maps showing Tartary have been thoroughly addressed in previous chapters. It was a geographical designation for poorly understood Central Asian regions. It appeared on maps because cartographers needed to label territories they knew existed but couldn't precisely characterize. Its gradual disappearance reflects increasing geographical knowledge as Russian expansion, Qing conquest, and European exploration replaced vague designations with specific names for peoples, territories, and administrative regions. There's no evidence supporting a unified Tartarian empire, as conspiracy theories describe it. The missing history argument misunderstands how historical knowledge works. Gaps exist for all regions and periods. Records are lost to fire, flood, war, neglect. Some things were never recorded because they seemed unimportant at the time. Central Asian history is actually reasonably well documented in Chinese sources, Persian chronicles, Russian imperial records, and indigenous accounts. What's missing from Western education often reflects curriculum choices. There's only so much you can teach in limited time rather than deliberate suppression. And increased scholarly interest has made Central Asian history more accessible in English and European languages than ever before. Historical photographs show what they show, but interpretation matters enormously. Images of damaged buildings usually result from war, fire, earthquake, or simple neglect, not mysterious catastrophes. Photographs of excavated structures show archaeological work or construction in progress, not evidence of buried civilizations. Selective presentation without context can make ordinary phenomena seem mysterious to people unfamiliar with how cities develop over time. Here's the fundamental issue. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. A vast, advanced empire spanning continents would leave extensive archaeological evidence. Architectural styles, material culture, and technologies would show distinctive, consistent patterns. Linguistic and genetic evidence would support large-scale population movements or unified governance. Documentary evidence would exist in multiple independent sources, not just European maps using a vague geographical designation for poorly understood territories. Genuine historical mysteries exist. Archaeological sites we haven't fully excavated, documents we haven't translated, questions we haven't answered. But Tartarian Empire, as conspiracy theorists describe it, isn't one of them. The evidence doesn't support it. The historical record contradicts it. And the mundane explanations for supposedly mysterious phenomena are well documented and readily available to anyone willing to engage with actual historical scholarship rather than YouTube videos. Historical knowledge is never complete. Records that were never made can't be consulted. Documents lost to fire or flood or war remain forever unavailable. Sources that exist but haven't been translated sit untouched in archives. This is true for all history, everywhere, but particularly for regions that received less scholarly attention until recently. Central Asian history has genuine gaps. Nomadic cultures leave less permanent archaeological evidence than settled societies. Tents decompose where stone buildings endure. Climate and environmental conditions degrade organic materials. Conflicts and conquests destroyed records deliberately or through collateral damage. Linguistic diversity means some historical sources remain inaccessible to most scholars, requiring expertise in Persian, Arabic, Chinese, Mongolian, various Turkic languages, and more. And for centuries, Western historical scholarship focused primarily on Europe and Mediterranean civilizations, treating Central Asia as peripheral rather than worthy of sustained attention. So what don't we know? The exact political structures and relationships between various steppe khanates in certain periods remain debated among specialists. The demographic impact of Mongol conquests can be estimated but not precisely calculated. How many died, how populations shifted, how quickly regions recovered. Details of trade networks and economic relationships often rely on fragmentary evidence, a mention in one chronicle, archaeological finds from a single site, patterns inferred from limited data. Aspects of nomadic social organization and cultural practices weren't fully documented by contemporary sources, particularly outsiders who observed without understanding underlying logic. The experiences of non-elite peoples are poorly represented in surviving sources. Royal chronicles document what kings did, court records preserve elite concerns. But what about commoners, women, ethnic minorities within larger khanates? Their voices are mostly silent in written records, though archaeology sometimes reveals what texts don't. Archaeological mysteries abound, cities mentioned in historical texts that haven't been definitively located. The full extent and nature of settlements in certain regions and periods where systematic survey hasn't occurred. Technological capabilities and craft traditions we can observe in surviving artifacts, but whose production methods remain incompletely understood. Artistic developments traceable through objects, but whose social contexts who commissioned them, what they meant to contemporary viewers, remain uncertain. Linguistic questions persist. The precise relationships between various Turkic and Mongolic language groups, migration patterns and population movements in prehistoric and early historical periods, reconstructed partially through comparative linguistics but incomplete. Origins and development of certain cultural practices and belief systems. How different peoples identified themselves versus how neighbors and outsiders identified them. Names shift depending on perspective and period. Documentary gaps create fundamental limitations. Many historical chronicles from Central Asian perspectives don't survive or haven't been translated into languages accessible to most scholars. Chinese, Persian, and Russian sources provide valuable information but reflect particular perspectives and interests. The view from imperial courts, not necessarily from steppe peoples themselves. Oral traditions preserve important historical memory, but distinguishing historical kernels from later elaboration requires careful methodology. Synthesizing sources from different cultural and linguistic traditions creates interpretive challenges when they contradict or simply don't align. Why do these gaps exist and persist? Central Asian studies requires expertise in multiple languages and cultural contexts. Not many scholars possess all the necessary tools. Archaeological work has been limited by political factors, funding constraints, and sheer geographical scale. Climate change, urban development, and looting threaten sites before they can be properly studied. The scholarly infrastructure for Central Asian history, while growing, remains less developed than for some other regions, meaning fewer resources, fewer researchers, slower progress. These genuine gaps create space for speculation. When documentation is incomplete, multiple interpretations become possible. But there's a crucial difference between acknowledging uncertainty and inventing narratives unsupported by evidence. Scholars work with incomplete information by developing probabilistic rather than definitive conclusions. They remain open to revision as new evidence emerges. They triangulate multiple sources and types of evidence. They're explicit about confidence levels, this is well established, versus this is our best hypothesis, given current evidence. Honest acknowledgement of what we don't know isn't weakness. It's required by rigorous historical methodology. It's what distinguishes legitimate inquiry from conspiracy theory invention. Historians admit gaps and work systematically to fill them. They change conclusions when better evidence appears. They say, "We don't know yet," when that's the honest answer. Genuine mysteries are fascinating precisely because they invite investigation rather than invention. The questions are real. The search for answers is ongoing. And sometimes, patient research actually finds those answers, revealing something new about human history, without requiring conspiracy to explain why it was ever unclear. History isn't finished. In 2020, archaeologists working in Kazakhstan examined satellite imagery showing unusual geometric patterns across acres of steppe. Ground investigation revealed a massive settlement from the 9th through 12th centuries that nobody knew existed. Excavation showed a sophisticated urban centre with metallurgy workshops, craft production, and evidence of long-distance trade connections. One discovery rewrote understanding of medieval Central Asian urbanism. That's how real historical mysteries get solved. Not through speculation on YouTube, but through systematic research, scientific methods, and patient excavation. Across Central Asia, ongoing archaeological work continues, revealing new sites and reinterpreting known ones. Excavations at ancient Merv, which served as capital for various empires, have revealed sophisticated urban planning, water management systems, and cultural achievements. Burial sites across the steppes provide information about ancient peoples, their genetics, material culture, social structures. Remote sensing and satellite imagery identify previously unknown archaeological features across vast landscapes that would take lifetimes to survey on foot. Technology transforms what's possible. LiDAR penetrates vegetation to reveal structures and features invisible to ground observation. Radiocarbon dating and other scientific methods provide increasingly precise chronologies. DNA analysis, extracted from ancient remains, reveals population movements, genetic relationships, health patterns. Isotopic analysis of teeth and bones shows where individuals spent their childhoods, what they ate, how they migrated during their lifetimes. Materials science examines artifacts to understand manufacturing techniques and trace trade relationships through sourcing of raw materials. Linguistic work continues, uncovering new information. Previously unknown manuscripts are examined and translated. Comparative linguistic analysis reveals relationships between languages and helps reconstruct historical migrations. Study of loanwords and linguistic influence shows cultural contacts. Recovery and analysis of oral traditions provides insights into cultural and historical memory that written sources missed. Digital humanities revolutionizes access and analysis. Creation of digital databases makes dispersed sources accessible to scholars worldwide. Computational analysis of large text corpora reveals patterns impossible to spot through traditional reading. 3D modeling and virtual reconstruction let researchers study archaeological sites remotely. Collaborative international projects connect scholars across institutions and countries, pooling expertise and resources. Genetic studies yield surprising findings. Ancient DNA from burials reveals population structures and movements. Genetic evidence clarifies relationships between modern and historical populations, sometimes confirming and sometimes contradicting what historical sources suggested. Genomic data shows mixing and migrations that written chronicles didn't fully document. Research reveals the genetic legacy of historical events like the Mongol expansion, visible in modern populations across Eurasia. These discoveries consistently show greater complexity than earlier scholarship recognized. They reveal connections between regions previously thought isolated. They provide material culture evidence for peoples who left few written records, giving voice to experiences that elite chroniclers ignored. They demonstrate dynamism and change in Central Asian societies, challenging static stereotypes. Specific findings excite specialists and general audiences alike. Textile preservation in dry Central Asian climates reveals sophisticated weaving techniques and far-reaching trade networks. Paleoclimatic data reconstructed from ice cores, tree rings, and sediment layers shows how environmental changes affected historical societies. Droughts, possibly triggering migrations, climate shifts, enabling or constraining different lifestyles. Epigraphic discoveries provide new texts in various languages. Architectural analysis reveals engineering capabilities and aesthetic choices that contemporary observers never fully described. Contemporary scholars approach Central Asian history with new frameworks. They incorporate indigenous perspectives and local scholarly traditions rather than viewing the region only through Western lenses. They use interdisciplinary methods combining archaeology, linguistics, genetics, climatology, and more. They acknowledge the colonial legacy in earlier scholarship and work to construct less biased narratives. They build collaborative networks among scholars from the region and internationally, sharing expertise and resources. Central Asian history isn't a closed book where everything is known. It's not a blank slate where anything can be imagined either. It's an active field of inquiry, where genuine discoveries emerge regularly through rigorous, methodologically sound research. Each new find adds pieces to the puzzle. Each technological advance enables questions that couldn't be asked before. Each translated text provides perspectives previously unavailable. The work continues. Archives hold unstudied manuscripts. The ground conceals unexcavated sites. New methods will reveal information we can't currently access. And patient researchers will keep discovering actual history more interesting than conspiracy theories because it's real. For generations, Western textbooks described the Mongol Empire primarily as destroyers. The Mongol hordes, who devastated civilizations from China to Eastern Europe. Contemporary historians tell a more complex story. Yes, the conquests were brutal, but the empire also created unprecedented global connections, facilitated technological transfer across Eurasia, enabled cultural exchange on scales never achieved before, and demonstrated sophisticated governance of the most ethnically diverse empire in human history. Same empire, different questions, different narrative. History isn't changing. Our understanding is improving. Earlier, Western scholarship approached Central Asia from colonial and Orientalist perspectives. The region was viewed primarily in relation to civilized centers: China, Persia, Russia, Europe. Emphasis fell on conquest and conflict, while minimizing cultural achievement. European categories and frameworks were imposed on societies they didn't fit. Steppe nomadic cultures were treated as primitive compared to settled agricultural societies, their political organizations dismissed as unsophisticated compared to European states. Contemporary scholarship challenges these approaches systematically. It centers Central Asian perspectives and sources, rather than treating them as peripheral to someone else's story. It recognizes steppe nomadic cultures as sophisticated adaptations to particular environments, not inferior alternatives to settled agriculture. It appreciates the political and organizational complexity of nomadic empires, which governed vast territories using systems different from, but no less effective than, European bureaucracies. It understands Central Asia as a dynamic region of innovation and exchange, not a passive space between other civilizations. Specific revisions reshape understanding. The Mongol conquests, once narrated almost exclusively as destruction, are increasingly understood for their role in creating trans-Eurasian connections that accelerated trade, cultural exchange, and technological transfer. The Silk Road, once simplified as a trade route, is now understood through the complex urban, agricultural, and nomadic societies that made long-distance exchange possible: the cities, the producers, the transporters, the consumers whose interactions created networks spanning continents. The role of women in steppe societies receives new attention. Historical sources often ignored women, but archaeological and anthropological evidence reveals more varied and sometimes more prominent roles than in contemporary settled societies. Elite women sometimes held significant political power. Property rights and social status differed from patterns in Europe or China, requiring understanding on their own terms, rather than as deviations from supposedly normal gender systems. Artistic and intellectual achievements of Central Asian courts and cities are being properly appreciated. These weren't cultural backwaters waiting for civilizing influence from elsewhere. They were centers of artistic innovation, scientific inquiry, and literary production that influenced and were influenced by developments across Eurasia. This revision transforms world history narratives. It demonstrates that Europe wasn't the only, or even primary driver of medieval and early modern trade and cultural exchange. It shows technological innovations flowing in multiple directions: papermaking and printing from China westward, astronomical instruments and mathematical concepts from Islamic world eastward and westward, metalworking techniques spreading along steppe routes. It reveals that political organization can take forms different from European nation-states without being less sophisticated or effective. New frameworks enable new insights. Environmental history shows how steppe peoples developed sustainable practices in challenging environments. Economic history reveals sophistication in nomadic and semi-nomadic production and trade. Social history recovers non-elite experiences. Connected history approaches see Central Asia as crucial connector between East Asian, South Asian, Middle Eastern, and European regions, not peripheral, but central to Eurasian integration. Scholars from Central Asian nations contribute essential perspectives, bringing linguistic expertise, grounding in local historical traditions, and challenges to narratives that served colonial or Soviet ideological purposes. They build scholarly infrastructure for research in the region, training new generations of specialists, creating institutions supporting systematic study. The decolonization of Central Asian history questions, whose voices are centered in narratives. It recognizes that Tartary itself was colonial knowledge production, a way Europeans organized information about regions they didn't control. It understands how maps reflected European power and epistemology as much as geographical reality. It works to construct narratives, respecting Central Asian peoples as subjects of their own history rather than objects of European observation. This ongoing revision demonstrates that history isn't a fixed story, but an active interpretation that changes as new evidence emerges, new questions are asked, and new perspectives are included. The past doesn't change. Our understanding of it constantly improves. That's not a weakness of historical knowledge, it's exactly how it should work. Most historical sources we possess were created by literate elites, state officials keeping administrative records, religious authorities documenting sacred events and institutional matters, educated classes with resources to produce and preserve written documents. This creates systematic bias running through everything we know about the past. We know far more about rulers than those they ruled, more about men than women in most societies, more about urban centers than rural areas, more about events the record keepers considered important than about daily life and ordinary people's experiences. This isn't conspiracy or deliberate suppression necessarily, it's just how historical preservation works. What gets written down, what gets kept, what survives centuries of deterioration and conflict, reflects the priorities and power of those doing the writing and keeping. For Central Asian history, this bias compounds in specific ways. Many sources are external Chinese officials documenting northern frontier peoples, Persian chroniclers describing eastern neighbors, Russian administrators reporting on newly conquered territories, European travelers observing exotic lands. When internal sources exist, they often reflect elite male perspectives in settled urban contexts. Nomadic peoples who left fewer written records are known primarily through others' accounts described rather than describing themselves. Oral traditions preserve crucial knowledge, but they were often not recorded until relatively recently, and then, usually by outsiders with particular interests and frameworks that shaped what they heard and how they transcribed it. Language creates another layer of difficulty. Sources in languages few scholars read remain understudied or completely unknown to broader academic communities. Translation always involves interpretation. Technical terminology and cultural concepts don't always move cleanly between languages. Historians often rely on translations, sometimes multiple removes from original sources, with each step introducing potential distortion or misunderstanding. Historical knowledge and power are inseparable. Imperial powers generated extensive documentation about regions they controlled or sought to control. This wasn't neutral observation. It served administrative and strategic purposes, creating knowledge shaped by imperial interests. Chinese historical sources on Central Asia portrayed neighboring peoples in ways that validated Chinese cultural superiority and territorial claims. Russian imperial documentation of Siberia and Central Asia reflected strategic concerns about expansion and resource extraction. European maps and geographical texts positioned Europe as the center, other regions as peripheral. Even well-intentioned scholarship operated within frameworks shaped by political and cultural contexts of scholars' own societies. The European maps we've examined, showing Tartary sprawling across Central Asia, reflected European organizing principles more than Central Asian self-understanding. The categories made sense to European minds, trying to organize unfamiliar information. Whether they made sense to people living in those regions was secondary. This shapes what gets remembered and forgotten. Societies that left extensive written records, or whose records were preserved by successor states, are better known. Those whose records were oral, written in languages few study, or destroyed in conflicts, remain obscure. Historical events deemed important by powerful record keepers got documented. Others didn't. Entire peoples, cultures, historical experiences can be marginalized or effectively erased from mainstream narratives simply through the mechanics of who had resources to preserve what. The Mongol Empire generated extensive records, administrative documents, legal codes, correspondence. Most were destroyed when the empire fragmented and successor states were conquered. What survived tells us what conquerors valued. Chinese records about Mongol rulers of China, Persian histories about the Ilkhanate, Russian chronicles about the Golden Horde's interactions with Russian principalities. But the Mongols' own voices, their self-understanding, their perspectives on events, largely lost. Efforts to recover marginalized histories work against these structural limitations. Ethnohistory engages seriously with oral traditions and community knowledge. Archaeology provides evidence for peoples who left few written records revealing material cultures and social patterns texts never captured. Linguistic and genetic studies reveal population histories not documented in chronicles. Collaborative research centers indigenous and local scholarly perspectives rather than treating them as merely informants for outsiders' projects. Historical narratives serve present purposes too. Nation-states construct national histories, emphasizing continuity, legitimacy, distinctiveness. Diasporic and minority communities preserve memories, dominant narratives ignore. Historical grievances and glories get mobilized for contemporary political purposes. Debates about history are simultaneously debates about identity, power, and the future. Understanding whose perspectives shaped historical knowledge helps recognize its limitations and gaps. Recovering marginalized histories isn't political correctness, it's intellectual honesty about the constructed nature of all historical narratives. History isn't what happened. History is what we can know about what happened, filtered through who recorded it, who preserved it, who studied it, who decided it mattered. That's not conspiracy. It's just how historical memory works. Tartary itself exemplifies something specific: colonial knowledge production. Not necessarily knowledge produced during formal colonial rule, but knowledge that positions European perspectives as neutral or universal, while treating other regions and peoples as objects of study, categorization, and naming rather than subjects with their own self-understanding. Consider what Europeans did. They assigned a name derived from one group, Tatars, associated primarily with Mongol invaders, to vast territories inhabited by dozens of diverse peoples: Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Kyrgyz, Mongols, countless others, each with distinct languages, cultures, political organizations. The naming reflected European linguistic and cultural frameworks, not how these peoples identified themselves. The cartographic representation organized space according to European geographical and political categories, and the very act of naming and mapping asserted European authority to know and describe regions most Europeans had never visited. What did Tartary obscure? The diverse self-identifications of peoples living there. The actual political structures and relationships, complex, shifting, sophisticated in ways European categories couldn't capture. The geographical knowledge possessed by peoples native to the region, who navigated those steppes and mountains with intimate understanding, European mapmakers lacked. The agency of Central Asian peoples in shaping their own histories, rather than simply being backdrop to European expansion stories. This pattern wasn't unique. India imposed conceptual unity on tremendously diverse regions with hundreds of languages, religions, political systems. Africa, as a continental category, obscured specificity of thousands of distinct peoples and cultures. Geographical naming worldwide reflected colonizers' perspectives rather than indigenous understandings. The power to name is power itself. Mapping and naming facilitated imperial expansion. Geographical knowledge served strategic and commercial purposes. Categories like Tartary made unfamiliar regions conceptually manageable to European minds. You can't plan expansion into chaos, but you can strategize about control of defined territories with labels, boundaries, supposed characteristics. The confidence of cartographic representation sometimes preceded actual control or even direct contact. The map claimed knowledge before knowledge truly existed. Watch how Tartary changed as European power dynamics shifted. Early maps showing vague Tartary reflected limited knowledge and limited European involvement. As Russian expansion proceeded through the 18th and 19th centuries, maps began showing Russian administrative divisions, replacing the vague designation. The Great Game drove more detailed intelligence gathering by competing British and Russian empires. Eventually, Tartary disappeared, as European imperial powers divided the region among themselves or established clear spheres of influence. The territory didn't vanish. European ways of organizing knowledge about it changed. Being named by others, rather than self-naming, represents power inequality. External categories can erase internal diversity and complexity. Colonial knowledge production created representations serving colonizers' interests, while marginalizing indigenous knowledge and perspectives. This is epistemic violence, not physical harm, but harm to ways of knowing, to the authority of non-European peoples to define themselves and their lands. Contemporary implications persist. Place names still reflect colonial histories. Geographical categories we take for granted, continental divisions, regional groupings, reflect particular historical perspectives. not natural or inevitable ways of organizing space. Decolonizing geography means attending to indigenous names, categories, spatial understandings. Here's where this connects back to conspiracy theories. Tartarian conspiracy theorists have latched onto Tartary as evidence of hidden history, but their focus on proving or disproving a Tartarian empire actually perpetuates the European framing. They accept the category, just argue about its nature. A decolonized approach would center Central Asian peoples' own historical understandings, rather than European cartographic designations. The real story, how European knowledge production worked, how it changed, what it revealed and obscured, is more interesting than fantasies about hidden empires. Critically examining Tartary as colonial knowledge doesn't mean denying the maps existed or that European geographical work had no value. It means understanding it as one particular way of knowing that reflected particular power relationships and cultural frameworks. The maps documented real European understanding of the period. What they didn't document was Central Asian peoples' understanding of themselves. That knowledge existed too, it just wasn't on European maps, because maps reflect the power to represent, and in the age of European expansion, that power belonged overwhelmingly to Europeans. While European cartographers drew speculative boundaries for Tartary, other knowledge systems operated simultaneously. Kazakh Aksakals' respected elders recited genealogies going back 20 generations, preserving precise information about kinship relationships, territorial rights, historical alliances. Kyrgyz storytellers performed the Manas epic, one of the longest epic poems in the world, encoding centuries of cultural memory about migrations, conflicts, heroes. Mongolian chronicles like The Secret History of the Mongols provided insider perspectives on empire formation that external sources never captured. These weren't primitive alternatives to European written history. They were sophisticated knowledge systems adapted to nomadic and semi-nomadic lifestyles, where oral transmission worked better than documents that could be lost, damaged, or become burdensome during seasonal migrations. Oral traditions preserve what written sources often miss: lived experience and emotional dimensions of historical events, perspectives of common people, not just elite courts, cultural values and worldviews shaping how events were understood, continuity of memory across generations, even when formal record-keeping was sparse or non-existent. A Jairao, a Kazakh bard, carried in memory what would fill volumes if transcribed, passing knowledge to apprentices through years of training. Working with oral traditions requires methodological care. Distinguishing historical kernels from later elaboration or mythologization isn't always straightforward. Oral traditions change through transmission, adapting to new contexts while maintaining core narratives. Dating events described in oral sources often proves difficult, and written transcriptions, usually done by outsiders, introduce interpretive layers. The Russian ethnographer, recording a Kazakh epic poem, brings their own frameworks, assumptions, interests to the transcription. But these challenges don't invalidate oral sources. They just require appropriate analytical approaches, same as written documents need source criticism and contextual understanding. Indigenous sources complicate the Tartary narrative fundamentally. Central Asian peoples had their own geographical knowledge and spatial organization. They identified themselves by specific ethnic, tribal, and regional affiliations, not as Tartars or inhabitants of Tartary. Political relationships and structures, as remembered in indigenous traditions, are more complex than European maps suggested. Cultural achievements preserved in oral tradition, poetry, music, crafts, astronomical knowledge, ecological understanding reveal sophisticated societies that European accounts sometimes portrayed as primitive nomads with simple cultures. Consider specific knowledge systems. Nomadic cultures preserved sophisticated astronomical knowledge for navigation and timekeeping, observing celestial patterns across seasons and years. Ecological knowledge about seasonal patterns, weather, animal behavior, enabled survival and success in environments that would challenge unprepared outsiders. Geographical knowledge of routes, water sources, terrain, mental maps, more detailed than European cartographic attempts for regions they actually inhabited. Social knowledge about kinship, alliance, conflict resolution governing complex intertribal relationships. Contemporary scholars work with indigenous sources through collaboration with tradition bearers and local scholars who understand cultural contexts and linguistic nuances. Linguistic expertise allows engagement with sources in original languages rather than relying solely on translations. Comparative analysis of multiple oral traditions from different groups can reveal convergences and divergences. Integration with archaeological and documentary evidence creates more complete pictures. Efforts to center indigenous perspectives include publishing and translating Central Asian sources, supporting scholarship by Central Asian scholars themselves, creating space in academic discourse for indigenous historical interpretations, recognizing oral traditions as legitimate sources deserving serious analytical engagement. What happens when indigenous and European sources are read together? Sometimes they confirm each other, providing triangulation. Sometimes they contradict, revealing different interpretations or interests. Gaps in one tradition might be filled by another. The comparison process reveals how perspective shapes historical narrative. What seems important from one position might be peripheral from another. Contemporary implications matter. Central Asian nations building post-Soviet identities draw on pre-Russian historical traditions. Diaspora communities maintain cultural connections through historical memory. Broader academic recognition grows that European sources alone provide incomplete understanding of Central Asian history. While Europeans debated the geography of Central Asia in libraries, nomadic peoples navigated thousands of miles of steppe with detailed mental maps of water sources, pastures, safe routes. The knowledge existed, it just wasn't on European maps. Understanding Central Asian history requires engaging with multiple perspectives, recognizing that European accounts represent only one way of knowing, one set of interests, one framework for organizing knowledge about a profoundly complex region where peoples lived, remembered, and understood their own histories long before Europeans tried mapping them from afar. Throughout history, peoples have genuinely been forgotten, languages have gone extinct, cultures have been suppressed or absorbed into others, historical records have been deliberately destroyed or simply allowed to decay into dust. This isn't conspiracy theory, it's documented tragedy. The Sogdian language once dominated Silk Road commerce. Sogdian merchants were the international business people of medieval Asia. Their language, the lingua franca of trade, spanning from China to the Mediterranean. Today, scholars can read Sogdian texts found in archaeological sites. No one speaks the language natively. It died, not in a dramatic catastrophe, not through coordinated suppression, just through gradual assimilation as Turkic and Persian cultures expanded across Central Asia, absorbing Sogdian communities until their distinct identity dissolved into larger populations. That's what real erasure looks like. Consider the Etruscans. They built sophisticated cities in ancient Italy, developed distinctive art and architecture, influenced Roman culture profoundly. Their language remains only partially deciphered, despite extensive Roman contact and numerous inscriptions. When Rome expanded, Etruscan culture was absorbed. Their cities became Roman cities. Their people became Romans. Within a few centuries, Etruscan as a living culture had vanished, known primarily through Roman sources that described them from outside. Carthage was deliberately destroyed by Rome. After 3 Punic Wars, Roman forces systematically demolished the city in 146 BCE. Historical accounts all Roman claim they sowed the fields with salt to make the land unusable. Whether literal or symbolic, the intent was erasure. Carthaginian culture, history, perspective survives primarily through Roman sources. We see Carthage through the eyes of those who destroyed it. Indigenous American peoples and cultures were decimated by disease, warfare, forced conversion, and colonization following European contact. Languages spoken for millennia went extinct within a few generations. Knowledge systems, agricultural techniques, astronomical observations, medicinal practices, oral histories were lost when elders died without being able to pass knowledge to students. Cultural suppression was sometimes policy. Boarding schools forbade native languages. Missionaries destroyed religious texts and artifacts. What survives does so despite systematic attempts at elimination. The mechanisms of erasure are well understood. Physical destruction through genocide or forced migration, linguistic suppression through forbidding native languages, and mandatory education in dominant languages. Cultural assimilation, absorbing peoples into dominant cultures until distinct identities disappear. Historiographical marginalization, excluding certain peoples and perspectives from historical narratives, even when they survive as populations. What traces persist when cultures are suppressed? Archaeological evidence provides material culture fragments. Loanwords in other languages preserve pieces of extinct tongues. The Persian language contains Sogdian remnants. evidence of vanished speakers. Genetic evidence shows population relationships and movements. Sometimes traditions survive in modified forms or among diaspora communities, maintaining memory of what was lost. Historians work with these fragments, reconstructing partial pictures from incomplete evidence. They acknowledge uncertainty about aspects that can't be recovered. They cross-reference different types of evidence: archaeological, linguistic, genetic, textual, each providing different information. They're explicit about what's known, what's inferred, what remains unknown. Honest scholarship requires distinguishing between these categories. Deliberate erasure differs from natural cultural change, though outcomes can be similar. Some cultures were actively suppressed by conquering powers with explicit policies of elimination. Others declined through demographic, economic, or environmental factors without coordinated suppression. The distinction matters for understanding historical responsibility and contemporary implications. But either way, knowledge is lost, cultures forgotten, peoples marginalized in historical memory. Central Asia has its own examples. Sogdian culture gradually absorbed, as mentioned. Various small ethnic groups disappeared into larger populations. Historical states and kingdoms left minimal records, and are known only vaguely if at all. Oral traditions were disrupted by Russian conquest and Soviet policies that relocated populations, suppressed local languages, and imposed standardized historical narratives. What does this reveal? Writing systems don't guarantee preservation. Sogdian had both writing and extensive documentation. Political power matters enormously. Dominant groups preserve their narratives more successfully than conquered or marginalized peoples. Institutional support, religious, educational, governmental helps maintain cultural knowledge. When transmission chains break, knowledge can vanish within a generation, as elders die and young people learn different languages, adopt different identities, forget different pasts. Contemporary efforts work to recover marginalized histories. Archaeological excavations reveal lost or forgotten cultures. Linguists reconstruct extinct or endangered languages. Oral history projects record elders' knowledge before it's lost forever. Historical scholarship recovers neglected sources and perspectives. Why does this matter? Every lost culture represents irreplaceable human knowledge and creativity. Historical erasure has contemporary consequences for identity and justice. Understanding how erasure happens helps prevent future losses. Recovering marginalized histories enriches collective human understanding, and it makes distinguishing real erasure from conspiracy claims more important, not less. Trivializing actual historical injustice by comparing it to unfounded theories about hidden empires does disservice to peoples who genuinely suffered marginalization and suppression. Real erasure deserves serious engagement, not appropriation for fantasy narratives. Historical manipulation isn't theoretical. It happens. Governments have censored records, altered textbooks, changed monuments, rewritten narratives to serve political purposes. Understanding real historical manipulation helps evaluate conspiracy claims by providing comparison. Stalin literally had people erased from photographs after purging them. We know because both versions survive the original photographs showing the purged officials, and the edited versions with those same people removed, airbrushed out of history. Soviet historical revisionism was systematic. Textbooks were rewritten to emphasize Marxist-Leninist narratives. Aspects of Soviet history deemed inconvenient: the Holodomor famine, the full extent of the gulags, agreements with Nazi Germany were suppressed or minimized in official accounts. Maoist China during the Cultural Revolution deliberately destroyed historical books, persecuted scholars, suppressed evidence that didn't fit revolutionary narratives. Temples were demolished, ancient texts burned. Educated people were sent to labor camps or killed. The goal was explicit: remake society by controlling interpretation of the past. Nationalist historiography across various countries has emphasized glory, victimization, or legitimacy, while downplaying uncomfortable aspects. Textbooks teach histories that make nations look good to themselves. Colonial education systems taught histories justifying imperial rule, while marginalizing indigenous perspectives, teaching colonized peoples that their histories began with European contact, that they were primitive before civilization arrived. The mechanisms are identifiable. Control education through curriculum requirements and textbook approval. Restrict access to archives or historical records. Promote particular interpretations through official commemorations and monuments. Censor alternative narratives through media control. Use historians and institutions to produce histories aligned with political purposes. Motivations vary but are usually transparent, building national identity around shared historical narrative, legitimizing current political systems or rulers by showing historical continuity or revolutionary break, managing historical grievances, either to promote reconciliation or to maintain them for political mobilization, controlling the present by controlling interpretation of the past. What makes these revisions eventually discoverable? Physical evidence survives despite censorship. The original Stalin photographs exist. Memory persists among people who lived through events. Survivors of the Holodomor remembered even when official histories denied it occurred. Outsider accounts provide alternative perspectives. Foreign journalists, diplomats, scholars documented what official sources suppressed. Eventually, political changes allow suppressed histories to emerge. Soviet archives opened after the USSR collapsed, revealing documentation of events long denied. This is crucial for evaluating Tartary claims. Soviet photo editing left original photographs proving manipulation. Suppressed, historical documents could be found when archives opened. Witnesses testified to events official histories denied. Physical evidence contradicted official narratives. For Tartary, none of this exists. No documents describing a unified Tartarian empire. No archaeological evidence of advanced civilization being systematically destroyed. No survivors or descendants maintaining suppressed knowledge across generations. No physical traces requiring explanation beyond conventional historical understanding. Why do conspiracy theorists point to real historical manipulation? Because it demonstrates governments do lie. Institutions do hide information. Official narratives sometimes are propaganda. This creates plausibility that other things might be hidden. It exploits declining institutional trust. If they lied about that, maybe they're lying about everything. But Tartary doesn't fit the pattern of actual historical manipulation. Real manipulation serves specific political purposes. What purpose would hiding Tartary serve across multiple countries and generations? Real manipulation leaves traces that eventually emerge. Where are Tartaries? Real manipulation affects living people with memories. Where are the witnesses to Tartarian civilization? Real manipulation involves specific, identifiable actors with motives who exactly suppressed Tartary. Why? And how did they coordinate globally? Acknowledging real historical manipulation makes rigorous evaluation more important, not less. Not all conspiracy theories are equally plausible. Distinguishing well-founded skepticism from baseless speculation requires examining evidence carefully. How to evaluate claims of historical suppression? Ask what specific evidence exists. Consider who would benefit from suppression and whether they had means to achieve it. Examine whether alternative explanations better fit available evidence. Apply the same standards of evidence to claims of suppression as to any historical claim. Historical manipulation is real. Soviet censorship, Maoist revisionism, nationalist myth-making, these are documented. But documentation is exactly what's missing for Tartary conspiracy claims. Real suppression leaves traces. It's never perfect. That's why we can prove it happened when it did. The absence of such traces for Tartary suggests nothing was suppressed, because there was nothing to suppress. Historical understanding changes. New evidence emerges from archives or excavations. New analytical methods allow different questions. Shifting perspectives reveal what earlier scholarship missed. This is normal. This is how knowledge advances. Legitimate historical revision is the lifeblood of scholarship. Scholars publish arguments with supporting evidence. Peer review evaluates methodology and evidence quality. Other scholars can examine sources and test claims. Consensus emerges gradually based on evidence strength. Revised understanding gets incorporated into mainstream historical knowledge when evidence is compelling. When archaeologists discover new evidence changing understanding of ancient Rome, new inscriptions, new excavations, new analytical techniques revealing information previously inaccessible, that's historical revision, normal scholarly progress. When someone claims Rome didn't exist because they find the achievements too impressive to believe, that's something else entirely. That's denialism. The difference is fundamental. Revision engages with evidence. Denialism rejects it. Denialism has identifiable characteristics. It rejects well-established facts despite overwhelming evidence. It starts with desired conclusions and cherry-picks evidence to support them. It dismisses contradicting evidence through conspiracy claims. All that evidence is fabricated or suppressed. It maintains positions regardless of evidence because they serve ideological or psychological needs beyond rational evaluation. Specific patterns emerge. claims that vast evidence is fabricated or suppressed by unnamed conspiracies. Assertion that absence of evidence for one's position actually proves conspiracy, they hid it so well there's no trace. Demanding impossible standards of proof for mainstream positions while accepting minimal evidence for alternative claims. Attacking credentials and motives of scholars rather than engaging with evidence and methodology. Holocaust denial ignores massive documentary evidence, physical evidence from camps, photographs, testimonial evidence from survivors and perpetrators, records from multiple countries and sources. Climate science denial rejects overwhelming scientific consensus, based on decades of research across multiple disciplines. Evolution denial prefers religious narratives to fossil evidence, genetic evidence, observed speciation, and theoretical frameworks that make successful predictions. How do you recognize the difference between revision and denialism? Revision is specific, challenging, particular interpretations or claims, while accepting the broader framework of evidence. Denialism is sweeping, rejecting entire bodies of established knowledge. Revision engages with evidence and scholarly methods, trying to better explain what we observe. Denialism dismisses evidence or reinterprets it to fit predetermined conclusions. Revision occurs within scholarly community through normal processes, publication, peer review, debate, eventual consensus, or continued productive disagreement. Denialism positions itself against the scholarly community, claiming special or suppressed knowledge, accusing researchers of bias or conspiracy. Apply these distinctions to Tartary. Legitimate questions about Central Asian history involve new evidence, better translations, indigenous sources, revised interpretations, standard scholarly work. This happens constantly. Understanding of Central Asian history improves through this normal process. Tartarian conspiracy claims are different. They reject vast evidence about actual Central Asian history documentary, archaeological, linguistic, genetic evidence from multiple independent sources. They demand accepting that elaborate historical fabrication occurred without explaining how thousands of people across centuries and countries coordinated such fabrication, why they did it, or what traces this massive conspiracy left. They position mainstream scholarship as part of conspiracy rather than engaging with evidence and methodology. Denialism has psychological appeals. It provides simple explanations for complex phenomena. It creates in-group identity among believers. It offers sense of superior knowledge. You've figured out what others missed or what authorities hide. It validates distrust of institutions. It absolves people from engaging with complex, nuanced evidence, requiring expertise to evaluate. But history matters. It shapes identity, informs policy, affects justice. False historical claims harm real people and communities. While everyone is entitled to opinions, not all opinions are equally valid when evidence is examined. How to productively engage with historical questions? Remain open to new evidence while maintaining evidentiary standards. Distinguish between uncertainty, which is honest and necessary, and denialism, which rejects evidence. Support scholarly work through funding, education, public engagement. Cultivate critical thinking about sources, claims, and the difference between questioning and rejecting. Tartary was on maps. We've explained why through normal historical analysis. That's revision, better understanding of cartographic practices and European knowledge of Central Asia. Claiming Tartary was an advanced empire erased from history despite zero supporting evidence? That's denialism. The distinction matters. Evidence matters. Truth matters. Even about the past. Who you are is partly shaped by stories about where you came from. Not just your personal family history, but the broader narratives connecting you across generations to peoples, places, cultures. Historical memory is how communities understand themselves, who their ancestors were, what they achieved, what they endured, how they came to be, where they are now. In Central Asia, this matters intensely. Post-Soviet nations building independent identities draw on pre-Russian histories. Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Kyrgyz, Turkmen, Tajiks peoples who maintained cultural distinctiveness through centuries of imperial rule now construct national narratives, emphasizing continuity, achievement, distinctiveness. Diaspora communities scattered globally maintain connections to homelands through historical memory. Various ethnic groups claim particular legacies from the complex mosaic of Central Asian history. But heritage claims get complicated. Different groups sometimes claim the same historical figures or empires. The Mongol Empire's legacy is claimed by modern Mongolia, but also relates to Kazakh, Uzbek, and numerous other peoples whose ancestors were part of that vast state. Historical boundaries don't match modern national borders drawn recently by imperial powers and Soviet administrators. Migrations, conquests, intermarriage mean ancestry and heritage are rarely simple. Here's where the Tartary conspiracy intersects with identity. For some people, it offers an attractive narrative, a powerful ancestral civilization, technologically advanced, unjustly forgotten, or deliberately erased. It provides a sense of impressive heritage, of ancestors who achieved great things. But here's the problem. For Central Asian peoples themselves, European conspiracy theories about Tartary actually obscure or oversimplify their real complex histories. The conspiracy replaces actual diverse peoples with a monolithic fantasy empire. It's a European-originated narrative, imposing itself over indigenous histories, yet again, first through vague cartographic labels, now through internet conspiracy theories. False narratives, however appealing, ultimately disrespect real historical experiences of real peoples. Your ancestors don't need to have built impossible buildings or possessed secret technology to be worthy of honor. The Kazakh herders who navigated thousands of miles of steppe with intimate geographical knowledge, maintaining sustainable practices in harsh environments across generations, they're worth remembering. The Uzbek craftspeople who created textiles, ceramics, metalwork of such beauty, it still moves us centuries later. They deserve recognition. The Mongol organizers who governed the most ethnically diverse empire in human history, creating administrative systems managing territories from China to Eastern Europe, that's a genuine achievement, requiring no embellishment. Understanding actual historical experiences, achievements and struggles, complexities and contradictions provides more solid foundation for identity than invented narratives. Real history honors ancestors by truthfully remembering them rather than fabricating impressive but false stories about them. Historical inaccuracy causes harm. It disrespects peoples whose actual histories get replaced with fantasies. It can fuel present conflicts when based on distorted grievances or territorial claims. It undermines trust when false claims are inevitably exposed. And it prevents learning from actual historical experiences, both the successes worth emulating and the failures worth avoiding. When nationalist historians invent ancient pedigrees for modern nations, they often erase the actual diverse peoples who inhabited territories, simplifying complex pasts into simple origin stories. When ideological groups claim historical support through distorted history, they undermine both historical understanding and contemporary debates. When conspiracy theories replace nuanced history with simplistic narratives, good guys versus bad guys, advanced civilization versus barbarism, truth versus cover-up, everyone's understanding suffers. History's relationship with justice is delicate. Historical wrongs, colonization, genocide, oppression require acknowledgement for any possibility of reconciliation. But justice requires accurate understanding of what actually happened. False claims of historical victimization or glory serve neither truth nor justice. Distinguishing real historical injustices from invented ones matters crucially for addressing legitimate grievances, while avoiding conflicts based on manufactured grievances. Central Asian peoples have actual histories of achievement, sophistication, and resilience, requiring no invention. Nomadic cultures developed remarkable adaptations and capabilities, worth celebrating on their own terms. The Mongol Empire genuinely was one of history's largest empires with massive global impact. Various Central Asian khanates, cities, and cultures made genuine contributions to art, science, trade, political organization that influenced development across Eurasia. Heritage and identity can be honored through accurate history, learning actual history of communities you identify with, acknowledging complexity including uncomfortable aspects, honoring ancestors through truthful memory rather than invention, recognizing that identity can be meaningful, powerful, worthy, without requiring ancestors to be perfect or superior to everyone else. The best tribute to any people is truthfully remembering and understanding their actual experiences, achievements, and challenges. Conspiracy theories like Tartarian Empire ultimately disrespect Central Asian peoples by replacing their complex, genuinely interesting real histories with European-originated fantasies, suggesting their actual lives weren't impressive enough without embellishment. They were. They are. Truth serves heritage better than fiction ever could. History isn't just about the past. Political actors invoke it constantly to justify territorial claims, to build alliances or enmities, to mobilize populations, to legitimate policies. Historical narratives shape present action in ways that affect millions of lives. In 2014, Russia justified annexing Crimea partly through historical claims about Russian presence and relationships with the peninsula. Whether accurate or not, and historians debate the interpretation, historical narratives justified political action with massive consequences. Borders changed, populations were affected, international relations shifted, all partially justified through interpretations of the past. Now imagine if political leaders took Tartarian Empire conspiracy theories seriously. This isn't entirely hypothetical. Some nationalist movements have incorporated elements of these theories. Historical fantasies can fuel real grievances, create false territorial claims based on imagined boundaries, distract from actual historical injustices deserving attention. Central Asian politics already involves complex historical narratives. Border disputes between nations sometimes invoke historical territorial claims which group historically occupied, which valley, which city belonged to which kingdom. Relationships between Central Asian states and Russia are shaped partly by historical memory of Russian imperial conquest and Soviet rule liberation or colonization, depending on perspective. China's relationships with Central Asian neighbors are influenced by historical Silk Road connections and Qing dynasty presence in regions now independent. Internal ethnic tensions are sometimes fueled by competing historical narratives about who arrived first, who has deeper roots, who suffered more. Historical inaccuracy creates political problems. False or distorted historical claims fuel unjustified grievances. Manufactured historical rights to territory or resources create conflicts over lands or resources. Oversimplified historical narratives prevent nuanced understanding of genuinely complex situations. When political decisions are based on inaccurate history, they're likely to create problems rather than solve them. Conversely, accurate history supports better politics. Understanding actual historical relationships helps navigate present tensions. Recognizing what genuinely happened allows addressing real grievances rather than manufactured ones. Acknowledging historical wrongs truthfully enables reconciliation, apologies, and reparations mean something when based on acknowledged facts. Recognizing historical complexity prevents simplistic solutions to complicated problems. Honest engagement with history builds trust between groups and nations because it demonstrates commitment to truth over propaganda. Political leaders bear responsibility. They can use history to build understanding rather than inflame conflict. They can ensure education provides accurate rather than propagandistic history. They can support scholarly work and archival access rather than restricting information. They can resist temptation to manipulate history for short-term political gain, even when that manipulation might boost popularity or justify desired policies. Civil society plays crucial roles too, supporting independent scholarship and media that can critique official narratives, creating spaces for dialogue about contested histories, where multiple perspectives can be heard respectfully, preserving diverse historical narratives and memories, especially from marginalized communities whose perspectives might otherwise be lost, cultivating critical thinking about historical claims from any source, government, opposition, or alternative media. The balance is delicate in post-colonial contexts. Former colonized peoples recovering marginalized histories and challenging colonial narratives is legitimate and necessary. But this recovery must be based on evidence rather than invention. The goal should be accurate history, acknowledging both indigenous achievements and colonial harms. Fighting historical injustice requires truth, not replacement of one set of myths with another. International cooperation on history is possible. Joint historical commissions examine contested events with scholars from affected nations. Shared archival access and scholarly exchange build common understanding. Commitment to evidence-based, rather than ideological history, provides framework transcending national interests. Recognition that multiple perspectives can coexist when grounded in factual events rather than competing fantasies. What's at stake? Political decisions affecting millions of people, peace and conflict between communities and nations, justice for historical wrongs requiring acknowledgement and sometimes reparation, the possibility of learning from history to avoid repeating mistakes. Tartary conspiracy theories might seem like harmless internet speculation, but historical falsehoods circulate, influence thinking, potentially shape politics. If enough people believe them, they could affect how Central Asian history is taught, how communities understand themselves, how political actors invoke the past for present purposes. False history doesn't just distort the past, It can reshape the present and future. That's why truth matters not abstractly, but concretely, politically, for the lives of real people navigating real challenges in a world partly shaped by how we understand where we came from. Education transmits knowledge across generations. It develops analytical and critical thinking skills. It prepares citizens for informed participation in society. It helps people understand the world and their place in it. History education serves all these purposes simultaneously, teaching people about past events and peoples, developing skills in evaluating sources and evidence, understanding causation, change, continuity, recognizing complexity and multiple perspectives. These aren't just about knowing facts. They're about developing intellectual capacities that extend far beyond history class. What happens when conspiracy theories infiltrate education? Students receive false information they must later unlearn. Time and resources divert from teaching actual content. Critical thinking is undermined when speculation is treated as equivalent to evidence. Trust in educational institutions erodes when they're portrayed as hiding truth rather than revealing it. The specific challenge of Tartary for educators. Students encounter conspiracy theories online and bring them to classrooms. Teachers must decide how to address false claims while respecting students' curiosity. Dismissing questions as stupid or wrong shuts down inquiry, but uncritically accepting conspiracy claims abandons educational responsibility. The solution is using students' questions as opportunities to teach critical thinking. Why did Tartary appear on maps? Legitimate question with factual answer we've explored throughout this documentary. Was Tartary a hidden advanced empire? Different question, requiring evaluation of evidence and reasoning. Teaching critical thinking about historical claims involves specific skills. Evaluating source quality and reliability. Who created this document? When? Why? For what audience? Distinguishing primary sources from later interpretation. Understanding how historians work with evidence, not accepting everything at face value, but not dismissing everything as fabrication either. Recognizing different types of historical claims. Well-established facts, probable interpretations based on evidence, speculative theories with minimal support. For Tartary, specifically, how to read historical maps in context, understanding cartographic conventions and limitations, evaluating whether sources actually support claimed conclusions, distinguishing between this appeared on maps true and therefore a unified empire existed, unwarranted inference, recognizing how cherry-picking evidence creates misleading narratives. Broader media literacy matters increasingly, evaluating online sources and claims in environments where anyone can publish anything, understanding how algorithms promote engaging but potentially false content because engagement generates revenue, recognizing rhetorical techniques, making weak arguments seem compelling emotional appeals, false dilemmas, appeals to supposedly hidden knowledge, developing healthy skepticism without descending into blanket cynicism that trusts nothing. A student who learns to evaluate evidence about Tartary, examining maps in context, understanding cartographic conventions, distinguishing evidence from inference gains skills applicable to every claim they'll encounter. Climate science, economic policy, medical advice, political campaigns. The goal isn't just knowing Tartary conspiracy is false, it's developing tools to evaluate any historical, scientific, or political claim independently. Students who learn actual Central Asian history gain multiple benefits. Understanding a major region and its peoples often neglected in Western education. Appreciating cultural and historical diversity beyond Europe and North America. Seeing how historical knowledge is constructed from sources rather than simply existing as facts to memorize. Learning about sophisticated non-European civilizations that challenge Eurocentric assumptions about who achieved what. Addressing conspiracy theories productively means acknowledging real questions underneath. Why did Tartary appear on maps? Providing factual, evidence-based answers. Teaching the skills to evaluate claims independently rather than simply accepting authority. Modeling respectful disagreement based on evidence rather than condescension toward those who believe differently. The stakes for society extend beyond individual students. Educated citizens make better decisions about governance, policy, leadership. Critical thinking skills apply beyond history to science, politics, daily life. Trust in institutions and expertise matters for addressing collective challenges, requiring cooperation and shared understanding. Ability to distinguish evidence-based knowledge from speculation is increasingly crucial in information-saturated environments where false claims spread as easily as true ones. The best defense against historical conspiracy theories isn't censorship or mockery, it's education, teaching actual history, developing critical thinking skills, cultivating intellectual humility and honesty that recognizes both what we know and what we don't, that values evidence over ideology, that seeks truth even when truth is complex and uncertain. That's what education gives us. Not just facts about the past, but the ability to think clearly about any claim, any evidence, any question we'll encounter. That ability might be the most important thing we can develop. After hours of exploration, after examining maps and sources, and conspiracy theories and real history, we can state clearly what Tartary was. Not speculation, not theory, what the evidence shows. Tartary was a real geographical designation that appeared on European maps from roughly 1,500 to 1,850. It referred to Central Asian territories that Europeans knew existed, but understood incompletely. The name derived from Tatar and Mongol peoples who had dominated these regions, particularly following the 13th century conquests under Genghis Khan and his successors. It was never a unified empire. It was a European label applied to diverse territories, peoples, and political entities that cartographers couldn't precisely distinguish or accurately represent. The actual history behind those maps is documented. The Mongol Empire genuinely controlled vast territories, creating the largest contiguous land empire in human history. After Genghis Khan's death, that empire fragmented into several khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Il Khanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Golden Horde across western steppes. These successor states persisted for centuries, gradually declining, fragmenting further, but maintaining political power and cultural influence long after the unified empire dissolved. Various Turkic and Mongol peoples inhabited the regions. Europeans labeled Tartary, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Kyrgyz, Mongols, Tatars, and dozens of other groups, each with distinct languages, cultures, political organizations. These were sophisticated societies. They developed remarkable adaptations to steppe environments. They created art, architecture, literature. They governed complex political entities. They participated in Silk Road trade networks spanning continents. They organized themselves differently from European nation-states, which made Europeans struggle to understand and represent them accurately. But different doesn't mean primitive or less sophisticated. European knowledge came through specific channels we've traced. Medieval and early modern travelers Marco Polo, Franciscan envoys, Ibn Battuta, provided accounts that shaped European imagination for centuries. Merchants trading along Silk Road routes generated practical geographical intelligence. Diplomatic contacts between European powers and Central Asian rulers produced political and military intelligence. And eventually, Russian expansion eastward and southward provided increasingly detailed information as the Russian Empire absorbed or dominated territories Europeans had vaguely labeled Tartary. Why did the term disappear? Not through conspiracy or deliberate erasure, through increasing knowledge. As European, particularly Russian exploration and conquest proceeded, vague labels were replaced with specific ones. By the 19th century, map makers could specify particular regions: Kazakh steppe, Siberian gubernia, Turkestan, Mongolia, Xinjiang province. They could name peoples accurately. They could show actual political jurisdictions, which territories belonged to Russian Empire, which to Qing China, which maintained independence. Tartary became obsolete not because it was suppressed, but because it was too imprecise for improved geographical understanding. The maps show European cartographic conventions and knowledge limitations. They document the evolution of geographical understanding over 3 centuries. They represent real territories and peoples. However, imperfectly those territories and peoples were understood by cartographers working from fragmentary information, and they reflect power dynamics inherent in Europeans naming and categorizing non-European regions according to European frameworks rather than indigenous self-understanding. The modern conspiracy theory takes the real appearance of Tartary on maps and constructs an unfounded narrative of advanced hidden civilization. It ignores the actual historical context explaining perfectly well why those maps appeared as they did. It provides no archaeological, documentary, genetic, linguistic, or other evidence for its central claims. It exhibits characteristics of denialism rather than legitimate historical inquiry, rejecting vast bodies of evidence, demanding acceptance of extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence, positioning itself against scholarly consensus through appeals to conspiracy rather than engagement with methodology. Clear conclusions. Tartary was a geographical designation, not a unified empire. No credible evidence supports claims of advanced Tartarian civilization, as conspiracy theorists describe it. The term's disappearance from maps reflects normal evolution of geographical knowledge from vague to specific. The actual history of Central Asian peoples and empires is genuinely fascinating, world historically important, and worthy of study without requiring invention of false narratives. Legitimate questions remain. Details of Central Asian history that scholars continue researching. Ongoing archaeological discoveries providing new insights. Scholarly debates about interpretation of evidence. Continuing work of recovering marginalized histories and indigenous perspectives. But these legitimate questions differ fundamentally from conspiracy claims. They're based on actual evidence and documented gaps. They're pursued through rigorous methodology. They remain open to revision based on new findings. They respect the complex reality of Central Asian history, rather than replacing it with European-originated fantasies. Tartary was real. It appeared on maps. We know why. There's no mystery requiring conspiracy to explain. The actual history is more interesting than any invented empire could ever be. The Tartary phenomenon teaches us something beyond Central Asian history. It reveals how we understand the past, how knowledge is constructed, how evidence relates to belief. Historical knowledge is always constructed from fragmentary evidence. No period of history survives completely in the record. We work with what remains: documents that were preserved, artifacts that didn't decay, structures that weren't destroyed, traditions that were transmitted. Historical understanding reflects both past realities and present perspectives. The questions we ask, the evidence we prioritize, the interpretations we find compelling, all these are shaped by our own contexts, assumptions, frameworks. Knowledge evolves as new evidence emerges and new questions are asked. What we understood about Central Asian history in 1700 differs from what we understood in 1900, which differs from what we understand now. Not because the past changed, but because our access to it improved. This is normal. This is how knowledge works. Tartary specifically teaches how maps are historical documents requiring interpretation in context. They don't simply show objective reality. They show what cartographers knew, what they assumed, what served their purposes and their patrons' interests. Names and categories on maps reflect namers' frameworks, not necessarily how named peoples understood themselves. Knowledge can be simultaneously real based on actual information and limited, incomplete, imperfect, filtered through cultural assumptions. The same evidence can be interpreted very differently depending on frameworks. Maps showing Tartary are facts. What they mean requires interpretation. Mainstream historical scholarship interprets them as European geographical designations for poorly understood regions. Conspiracy theorists interpret them as evidence of hidden advanced civilization. The maps themselves don't change. The frameworks for understanding them differ dramatically. This reveals lessons about conspiracy thinking. It often takes real phenomena maps genuinely showing Tartary and constructs unfounded narratives around them. It exploits genuine gaps in knowledge or education. Most people weren't taught about Tartary in school, so learning it appeared on maps feels like discovering hidden knowledge. It serves psychological needs beyond truth-seeking community, meaning, sense of insight. And distinguishing conspiracy thinking from legitimate skepticism requires examining evidence and methodology, not just surface plausibility. The phenomenon reveals much about contemporary information landscape. Abundance of information doesn't guarantee knowledge. Anyone can publish anything online. Algorithms amplify engaging content regardless of accuracy. Conspiracy videos get views, so platforms recommend them. Communities can collectively construct elaborate false narratives through participatory culture, each person adding a piece, building a structure that feels comprehensive but lacks foundation. Media literacy and critical thinking are increasingly essential, not just for history but for navigating daily information, environment news, health advice, political claims, everything. Tartary teaches lessons about power and knowledge. Who has authority to produce knowledge matters. European cartographers had power to name Central Asian regions. Indigenous peoples' own understandings didn't appear on European maps. Marginalized perspectives have often been excluded from historical narratives, but recovering suppressed voices requires evidence and rigor, not invention. Making up Tartarian Empire doesn't honor Central Asian peoples, it replaces their actual histories with European fantasies again. The phenomenon teaches about engaging with alternative claims. Dismissing them without engagement creates defensiveness. Addressing them seriously while maintaining evidence standards is more productive. Understanding why people believe things is valuable. It reveals psychological needs, educational gaps, institutional trust problems, and distinguishing the claims which can be wrong from the people who deserve respect matters for productive dialogue. Historical responsibility emerges clearly. We owe actual past peoples truth, not flattering inventions. Historical accuracy matters for present justice and future decisions. Honest engagement with history's complexity serves us better than simplified narratives that make us feel good but aren't true. Lessons about education become apparent. Teaching students to think critically about sources and claims. Helping people understand how historical knowledge is constructed from evidence. Providing engaging content about actual history to compete with conspiracy theories. Modeling intellectual humility alongside commitment to evidence. Acknowledging what we don't know while maintaining standards for what we do. The question was never really whether Tartary existed. It did, as a geographical designation. The question was, how do we know what we know about the past? How do we distinguish evidence from speculation? These are questions worth pondering. Questions that matter far beyond any single historical claim. Questions that shape how we understand everything. We started with mysterious maps showing a country that no longer exists. We've traveled through centuries of history, across continents of geography, into depths of how knowledge is made and lost and remade. Now, as this journey concludes, we can look back at what we've discovered. The Mongol Empire genuinely changed world history. The sophisticated nomadic cultures that developed on Central Asian steppes, adapting brilliantly to challenging environments. The diverse peoples, languages, political systems that Europeans imperfectly labeled Tartary, each with rich histories deserving recognition. The evolution of European geographical knowledge, showing how understanding grows through contact, evidence, questioning. The ongoing scholarly work, revealing more about these fascinating regions. With every excavation, every translated text, every genetic study, mysteries remain. Aspects of Central Asian history we're still discovering. Questions scholars debate with evidence-based arguments. Knowledge that may be permanently lost to time and circumstance. And the excitement of ongoing research, archaeologists in Kazakhstan finding cities nobody knew existed, linguists reconstructing extinct languages, historians recovering voices marginalized in earlier narratives. This is the value of honest historical engagement. It honors past peoples by remembering them truthfully, not by inventing flattering fictions about them. It provides richer, more interesting narratives than fantasies ever could. It teaches us about human diversity, capability, resilience across cultures and centuries. It offers lessons relevant to present challenges and future possibilities. For those who came to this documentary believing conspiracy theories about Tartary, understand, your curiosity about history is valuable. The questions you asked were worth asking. Why did this appear on maps? What does it represent? These are good questions. Evidence-based answers are more satisfying than speculation because they're grounded in reality, in what actually happened, in human experiences that genuinely occurred. There's no shame in revising understanding based on better information. That's how learning works. That's how all of us grow in knowledge. The human drive to understand the past is fundamental. Across cultures, throughout time, people have told stories about ancestors and origins. We create meaning through historical narratives, connecting us across generations. Curiosity about where we came from shapes every society. This drive, when channeled through evidence and critical thinking, produces genuine knowledge that enriches us all. Maps are human artifacts, revealing both what we know and what we don't. They're beautiful objects, deserving appreciation for craftsmanship and artistry. They're historical documents requiring interpretation in context. The maps showing Tartary tell us as much about European cartographers as about Central Asian territories, about limitations of knowledge, about power to name and categorize, about the slow growth of understanding across centuries. The internet spreads both misinformation and knowledge. The platforms amplifying conspiracy theories also make historical sources accessible to anyone curious enough to seek them. The challenge is developing wisdom to distinguish reliable from unreliable information. Education and critical thinking are our best tools for navigating information abundance. Tartary appeared on maps because Europeans needed to label territories they knew existed. It disappeared because knowledge improved, precision replaced vagueness, specific names replaced general designation, no conspiracy required. The actual history is worth knowing on its own terms. Fascinating, complex, revealing about both Central Asia and Europe, about peoples and cultures, about how humans create knowledge. Continue exploring if curiosity calls you. Central Asian history is increasingly accessible through books, articles, documentaries, primary sources translated into multiple languages. Approach with curiosity and critical thinking. Question claims. Examine evidence. Appreciate complexity. There's always more to discover about the endlessly intricate human past. As you drift towards sleep tonight, think about the merchants who traveled Silk Road routes, navigating thousands of miles with intimate geographical knowledge. The cartographers who tried mapping lands they'd never seen, doing their best with fragmentary information. The peoples who lived rich lives in regions Europeans called Tartary, loving, struggling, achieving, creating. They were real. Their achievements were real. Their histories are worth knowing. And somewhere tonight, researchers are still discovering their stories, piecing together fragments, expanding our understanding. The past isn't fixed. Our knowledge of it grows with every generation. That's not conspiracy. That's the beautiful, ongoing human project of remembering. Sleep well.